Hey, come on in, get comfortable. I don't know where you're tucked in from tonight or what your day looked like before this moment, but I hope it's finally letting you go. Maybe there's a cup of something warm cooling beside you. Maybe the blanket's already pulled up around your shoulders. Good. That's exactly how I want you tonight, because the story we're about to sit with together is a strange one. The kind that makes you look at a map a little differently afterward, and maybe even wonder about your own family tree. So get soft, get quiet, and let's begin. In the year 2019, archaeologists knelt beside a quiet river in the far east of Russia and pulled 3 human skeletons from the frozen ground. Nothing about the burial looked strange. But when scientists later uncovered the story hidden inside their bones, the results made no sense. Because buried in Siberia were traces of a people who should have lived an ocean away in a land called America. Before we go further into this one, if these quiet, strange corners of history are exactly why you keep coming back on nights like this, would you do something small for me? Tap that like button. Leave a comment down below and tell me where you're settling in from tonight, or just say hello. I look through every single one, and it means more than you'd think, and if you enjoy the way these stories unfold, hitting subscribe helps more of them find their way to you later on. Alright, enough of that. Dim the lights if you can. Let a fan hum quietly in the background, just enough soft noise to make the room feel smaller, closer. Get under the covers, because tonight is not just a story about the past. It's about a secret that scientists themselves almost refuse to believe. Let's go back to that riverbank. Picture the far eastern edge of Russia, so far east that if you kept walking you'd eventually run out of Asia altogether. This is the Kamchatka Peninsula, a finger of land pointing down into the cold Pacific covered in volcanoes and pine, with a river running through it that shares the same name. It was late in the season, the kind of stretch when daylight starts leaving early and the ground turns hard and stubborn under a shovel. Somewhere upstream a bird called out over water nobody was really paying attention to. This was not glamorous work. Field work like this rarely is. The water there runs the colour of steel most of the year. Cold air rolls down off the mountains and cuts through wool like it isn't even there. And along the muddy bank of that river, a small team of archaeologists spent their days on their knees, in the dirt brushing away centuries of silence, probably complaining about their fingers the entire time. Nobody signs up for fieldwork in that part of the world for the pleasant weather. They weren't expecting to find anything remarkable. Riverbanks like this one had given up bones before. Old hunting camps, old graves, the quiet leftovers of people who lived and died along the water long before anyone wrote their names down. So when the team uncovered the remains of 3 people buried near each other, it felt almost routine. A little sad maybe the way any grave is, but nothing that looked like it would end up rewriting a chapter of human history. The bones were old and fragile, so careful hands wrapped them, labelled them and sent them off. First to a laboratory in Russia, and eventually across an entire continent to a quiet research building in Germany. That's where a paleogeneticist named Cosimo Post was waiting along with a team that had spent years learning how to ask very old bones to give up their secrets. Here's a small strange fact most people never think about. When scientists want to pull deoxyribonucleic acid, the genetic material carrying someone's entire biological history out of bones that are hundreds, sometimes thousands of years old, they don't usually reach for the ribs or the arms or the surface of the skull. They go for one tiny dense piece of bone hidden just behind the ear called the petrous bone. It's shaped almost like a small pyramid, and it happens to be the hardest, most protected bone in the entire human body. So if a fragment of someone's genetic story survives at all after 500 years underground, it's usually hiding in there, the body's own vault keeping its secrets long after everything else has gone quiet. The team drilled out a small amount of bone powder, no bigger than a pinch of flour, and got to work. This is where the story stops being routine. When the first results came back, someone on that team almost certainly stared at the screen a little too long. Somewhere nearby, a cup of coffee sat forgotten and cold. The kind of ordinary lab moment nobody bothers to photograph right before it quietly turns into the moment everyone remembers. Because the genetic code from these three individuals found buried on a quiet riverbank in Russia carried something that, according to everything scientists thought they understood, should not have been there at all. Traces of ancestry belonging to people from North America. Let that sit for a second. Not similar ancestry, not distantly related ancestry. Actual genetic threads connecting these Siberian remains to populations living an entire ocean away, on a continent most of us grew up learning about as somewhere people travelled, to never somewhere people came from. For almost a century, the story taught in classrooms everywhere from Alaska to London went something like this. Thousands of years ago, back when the Ice Age still gripped most of the northern world, groups of hunters crossed a strip of land connecting Asia and North America, a place scientists now call Bering, following herds of animals east. And once they crossed, that was supposed to be that. One direction. A single, one-way journey into a new world. It's in the textbooks. It's on the little animated maps in natural history museums, the ones with the single confident arrow pointing east and never ever pointing back. Nobody was ever supposed to come back. It would not be the first time history got quietly rewritten by evidence nobody expected. For generations, most people were taught that a sailor named Christopher Columbus was the first person from the Old World to ever set foot in the Americas. Then, in the 1960s, archaeologists working in Newfoundland, Canada, uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement, proving that Viking sailors had crossed the Atlantic and lived in North America almost 500 years before Columbus was even born. History, it turns out, has a habit of humbling the people who think they already know the whole story. So when the lab results suggested otherwise, the first reaction inside that research building was not excitement. It was suspicion. Scientists checked the sequencing. Then they checked it again. And again, probably because nobody wants to be the person who announces something like this to the whole world, only to find out later that a sample got mixed up on some ordinary Tuesday afternoon. That is not the kind of mistake anyone lives down at a research conference. But the results held, every single time they ran it. And here's something worth knowing, especially in a world where headlines love to shout about a brand new genetic discovery every other week. Real scientists are almost never the ones rushing to believe something wild. It's usually the opposite. The harder a claim is to accept, the more times it gets tested, argued over and tested again before anyone dares to put it in writing. Once the team finally felt confident, they did what serious researchers do. They published everything, every method and every measurement in a respected scientific journal, out in the open, where any expert anywhere in the world could try to challenge it, repeat it, or prove it wrong. Nobody succeeded. Which, if you think about it, should make you trust this story more, not less. And this actually was not entirely out of nowhere. A few years earlier, other researchers working with scattered clues from language and older genetic studies had already started whispering about the possibility that people might have moved back across that stretch of water at some point. But whispers are not proof. Nobody had bones in hand. Nobody had a clean, undeniable case. Until now. Here's the detail that turns this from interesting into something closer to remarkable. These three people, the ones lifted from that riverbank, had lived around 500 years ago, which means whatever caused this genetic connection had already happened long before that. It was not new. It was not some strange accident, one lonely traveller washing up on the wrong shore, by chance the kind of thing you could shrug off as a fluke. Then the researchers did something even more revealing. They compared these 500-year-old bones to the genetic makeup of people living in that same region of Russia today. And the ancestry connected to North America, that same thread found buried in those ancient bones, showed up twice as strong in the people living there right now. Twice as strong. Think about what that actually rules out. If this had happened only once, some ancient accident lost to time, you would expect that signal to fade with every new generation diluted a little more each time, like a drop of ink stirred into an ever larger glass of water. Instead, it grew stronger, which means it was not a single event. It kept happening. Quietly, generation after generation, in ways nobody had written down, nobody had mapped, and nobody until very recently had ever proven. It's a little like finding a message in a bottle that was never supposed to make it back to its own shore, except this particular message was not written in ink. It was written in blood, copied quietly from parent to child, for well over 100 generations, until a small team of scientists in white coats finally figured out how to open the bottle. I think about that a lot, actually, because somewhere in all of this were real families, not just data points on a chart. A mother teaching her child how to read the shape of the ice before stepping onto it. A grandfather passing down a story about where his people came from, never once suspecting that the true answer stretched across an entire ocean, carried home in someone's blood centuries before either of them were born. If any of them had taken one of those popular ancestry tests, so many of us have tried today just for fun at a family gathering, or out of pure curiosity. Late one night, their results would have shown a strand of ancestry that on paper made no geographic sense at all. And yet, there it would be, undeniable, written into every cell of their body, waiting patiently for someone someday to finally ask the right question. Somewhere in the deep past, people who should have belonged entirely to one side of the ocean found their way back to the other. Not once, more than once, and their descendants are still there today in the far northeastern corner of Russia, quietly carrying pieces of a homeland most of them have never even heard mentioned, in their own family stories passed down instead as folklore, as half-remembered songs, as nothing more than a feeling that their people had always somehow belonged to two worlds instead of one. Maybe that's the part of this story that stays with me most. Not the science, remarkable as it is, but the quiet reminder that home is not always a fixed point on a map. Sometimes it's a direction your ancestors chose to walk long before you existed, for reasons nobody bothered to write down. So how does something like this happen? How do people who supposedly left Asia behind for good end up leaving their mark back where they started thousands of years later, on the very shore their ancestors once walked away from? To answer that, we cannot stay on this river bank. We have to go back further than 500 years, further even than 5,000. We have to go back to a piece of land that does not exist on any map today. A bridge between two worlds swallowed whole by the sea from back when the story of two continents began quietly as the story of just one. Most people, when they picture this vanished land, imagine a thin strip of ice, something you could sprint across in an afternoon if the wind cooperated. That picture is almost entirely wrong. Scientists call this place Beringia, and honestly, calling it a bridge might be one of the most misleading nicknames in the whole history of archaeology. A bridge suggests something narrow, something you cross quickly without ever really living there. But Beringia was not a passage. It was a world. By some estimates, at its widest, this vanished land stretched nearly 1,000 miles from north to south, and in places almost 3,000 miles from west to east, reaching from deep inside what we now call Siberia, past the outline of modern Alaska, and into the edges of Canada's Yukon. That is not a bridge. That is closer to a lost continent, one that simply is not there anymore, because the ocean quietly swallowed it inch by inch over thousands of years. Here's how that happened, in case you're the kind of person who likes the mechanics behind a good mystery. During the coldest stretch of the last ice age, somewhere between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, so much of the planet's water was locked up inside massive sheets of ice that the ocean itself dropped. Not by a little, by close to 400 feet lower than where it sits today. Entire stretches of ocean floor along the coastline simply became dry ground. Islands turned into hilltops, old seabeds turned into meadows, and the gap between Asia and North America, the one filled today by cold grey water, opened up into solid earth. Now, if you're picturing something like the Arctic you've seen in nature documentaries, endless white snow piled in drifts, maybe a lonely polar bear somewhere off in the distance, you should probably let go of that image too. Beringia looked nothing like that. It was dry. Strangely, almost stubbornly dry. The same ice sheets that lowered the sea level also blocked moisture from drifting in off the ocean, so while the rest of the far north sat buried under snow and glacier, the heart of Beringia stayed clear cold and close to bone dry. Scientists have a name for this odd condition. They call it cryo-aridity, bitterly cold air that somehow never carries enough moisture to build up real snow. Without heavy snowfall, without forests, without the soggy tundra most of us associate with the Arctic today, this land became something closer to a windswept frozen grassland. Researchers now call it the Mammoth Steppe, and it might be one of the strangest ecosystems that has ever existed on this planet. Picture rolling treeless plains under enormous open skies, the wind constantly stirring dust and fine grit across the ground, rivers narrowed down to thin half-frozen streams, and walking across all of it, actual herds of woolly mammoths grazing beside steppe bison, wild horses and saiga antelope, an animal that looks a little like it wandered in from somewhere far stranger than Siberia. At dusk, when the low sun turned the whole grassland the colour of rust, those herds would have cast shadows for what must have looked like miles. Where there is prey, there are always predators, and Beringia had plenty. Giant short-faced bears taller than most doorframes when they stood upright, scimitar-toothed cats, packs of grey wolves moving low across the grass. It was not a gentle place, but it was against every expectation alive. Have you ever tried to picture what it would feel like to live somewhere so isolated that you had no idea a wider world even existed past the horizon? Not because you chose that isolation, but because the land itself simply gave you nowhere else to look. That is roughly the situation a small population of people found themselves living inside in Beringia for a very long stretch of time. This is where geneticists studying old maternal genetic patterns, the kind of genetic material passed down quietly from mother to child, notice something curious. The ancestors of Native American peoples appear to have split away from other Asian populations surprisingly early, and yet they did not show up in the archaeological record of the Americas until thousands of years later. For a long time, that gap simply did not make sense. Where were these people during all of those missing centuries? The leading explanation today has a name almost as evocative as the mystery itself. Researchers call it the Beringian standstill. The idea is that a population of people became stranded, genetically speaking, inside Beringia itself, cut off from their relatives back in Asia, and not yet ready, or not yet able to move further into a brand new continent. Estimates for how long this standstill lasted vary quite a bit depending on the method used, ranging from a couple thousand years on the low end up toward 9,000 years or more on the high end, with a commonly cited middle estimate landing somewhere around 5,000 years. 5,000 years. Think about what that actually means in human terms. That is somewhere around 200 generations born, raised, grown old, and buried all within the same stretch of windswept grassland, without ever meeting another human group, without knowing that other people, other cultures, other whole ways of living existed anywhere else on this earth. Their entire universe was mammoth steppe wind and each other. Geneticists actually have a rather elegant piece of evidence backing this up. Years ago, researchers studying a specific quietly unusual genetic marker found something remarkable. This particular marker tucked away in a stretch of the genetic code turned up in nearly every indigenous population they sampled across the entire Western Hemisphere, from communities in Alaska all the way down to the southern tip of Chile, and even among the Inuit of Greenland and the Chukchi living across the water in Siberia. Yet this same marker was completely absent everywhere else on the planet, from every population sampled across Europe, Africa, and the rest of Asia. The simplest explanation researchers could offer was that every one of these far-flung, wildly different peoples all descend from one single founding group. A group that for a long stretch of time had absolutely nowhere else to go but the grassland underneath their feet. For decades, this idea created a real problem for the very scientists proposing it. If people really lived in Beringia that long, there should be campsites somewhere. Tools, old fire pits, some scrap of physical proof left behind in the ground. And for years, archaeologists searched and mostly came up empty-handed. A few researchers quietly began wondering if the whole standstill idea might simply be wrong. Then slowly an uncomfortable answer started to take shape. What if the evidence was never actually missing? What if it was only sitting somewhere nobody could reach anymore? Here's the reasoning. The most livable parts of Beringia, the low-lying river valleys, where a little brush and scrubwood could still grow, where fresh water ran, where people could realistically build a life, were almost without exception the lowest points across the whole landscape. And low points are exactly the areas that disappear first once the sea starts climbing back up. While the higher, drier ridgelines of old Beringia remain visible and searchable today, sitting safely above water across modern Alaska and Siberia, the cozy, resource-rich lowlands where people most likely built their homes are now resting under sometimes more than 100 feet of cold ocean water. The campsites were never gone. They were only ever out of reach. It's honestly one of my favourite quiet ironies in this entire story. The very ocean that eventually reconnected two continents through modern shipping lanes and passenger flights is the same ocean that hid the physical proof of the people who lived through the whole thing in the first place. That has not stopped people from trying to find scraps of proof on the parts of Beringia still sitting above water. Over in the Yukon Territory of Canada, at a site called Bluefish Caves, researchers uncovered animal bones bearing marks that look to some experts suspiciously like they were cut by human tools dated to somewhere around 24,000 years ago. If that dating and interpretation hold up under continued scrutiny, it would place people in the region thousands of years earlier than most textbooks currently admit. Other scientists remain cautious, arguing the marks could have natural explanations instead. That is how real science tends to work, by the way, messier and slower than any documentary usually makes it look. Meanwhile, a research team out of Brown University spent years digging through lake sediment in Alaska, searching for microscopic traces of ancient human waste and campfire soot, hoping to find a chemical fingerprint of people living there tens of thousands of years ago. Their early results hinted at something promising, though the full picture is still being pieced together. Nobody gets to plant a flag and call this case fully closed. Not yet, anyway. Still, every so often the land gives something back. In Russia, along the western edge of what used to be Beringia, researchers digging at a site near the Yana River pulled up a fragment of worked mammoth ivory. When they sent it off for dating, the results came back, placing it at roughly 21,000 years old, meaning it was shaped by human hands during the harshest, coldest peak of the entire Ice Age, right as most of the northern world sat locked under glacier. People were not simply surviving out there. They were making things, tools, objects with clear intention behind them, proof of an actual life, not just a bare existence. And here's a detail that quietly reshapes the whole picture even further. Beringia connected two continents for thousands of years, and yet strangely not everything crossed it. Woolly rhinos, for example, roamed huge stretches of Siberia right up to the edge of a river called the Anadyr, and then for reasons scientists still argue about simply stopped. They never went any further east. Meanwhile, certain North American animals stayed just as firmly locked to their own side of the grassland, never once wandering west into Asia, even though nothing except habit or instinct or some invisible ecological line was actually stopping them. So the land connected two worlds. But a connection, it turns out, is not the same thing as a crossing. A bridge existing does not automatically mean anyone or anything chooses to walk across it. And the world itself was not standing still either. As the climate slowly warmed after the coldest peak of the Ice Age passed, that dry, dusty mammoth steppe began to change under everyone's feet. Wetter air crept in. Shrubs took root where only grass had grown before. Eventually, soggy tundra started replacing the open grassland entirely. For the mammoths, the bison, the wild horses that had ruled this landscape for so long, that shift was close to catastrophic, their grazing grounds slowly shrinking toward extinction. But for a newer animal moving into the gaps, the moose, all that fresh woody growth was a gift, and their numbers reportedly surged. The world these people had always known, the only world their ancestors had known for 200 generations, was quietly dissolving underneath them, which, if you think about it, makes the choice our own ancestors eventually made feel a little less like a simple accident of geography and a little more like an actual decision. Something shifted. Something pushed a population that had lived quietly, generation after generation inside the same windswept grassland, to finally start moving again further east into land no human being had ever set foot on before. I don't think that decision gets talked about nearly enough. We tend to treat this whole migration like an inevitability, one confident little arrow drawn across a timeline in a textbook. But somewhere out there, real people looked out at an unfamiliar horizon and chose to keep walking into it anyway, with no idea what waited on the other side, and absolutely no way of knowing they were about to become the ancestors of civilizations that would eventually rise across two entire continents. I find something quietly moving about that. Every single person alive today whose family history traces back through the Americas exists because someone generations upon generations ago stood at the edge of everything they had ever known and kept walking anyway. Not for glory, not for a place in any history book, since none of them could have imagined such a thing even existed. Just for the plain, stubborn hope of finding somewhere better for the people they loved. That choice and everything that came after it is where we're headed next. Because this story does not end with people simply arriving somewhere new. That is closer to where it truly begins. And the paths those first travellers actually took the routes carved into stone and coastline, along with some surprisingly strange evidence of exactly how they moved once they finally left Beringia behind for good, is a story with its own twists still waiting to unfold. Here's something that still catches most people off guard, even ones who think they already know this story well. For a long time, scientists assumed the people who eventually crossed into a brand new continent were one single tidy population, one group, one story. As it turns out, reality was far messier and honestly far more interesting than that. The clue that blew the whole simple version apart came from a burial site near Lake Baikal in south-central Siberia, discovered all the way back in the late 1920s. Inside, researchers found the remains of a small child laid to rest, with real care surrounded by flint tools, a beaded necklace, and a scattering of small carved pendants. Whoever buried that child clearly loved them. You do not scatter beads and carved ornaments over a body you consider unimportant. For decades, this little grave was just one more curious entry in a dusty catalogue of Siberian archaeology. Nobody had any real way of asking the child's bones what they actually knew. Then, in 2013, a research team led by a scientist named Eski Willislev finally had the technology to ask. They pulled genetic material from the boy's remains, now understood to be roughly 24,000 years old, and sequenced his entire genome, at the time the oldest complete genetic blueprint ever recovered from a modern human being. What they found did not just add a footnote to the story of the Americas, it rewrote an entire chapter. By every genetic measure, this child looked nothing like the East Asian populations most researchers had always assumed were the sole ancestors of Native Americans. His genetic makeup instead resembled people from far to the west, closer to modern Europeans and populations from Western Asia. And yet buried inside that same genetic code were signatures found nowhere else on the planet, except in the bloodlines of modern Native American peoples, from the Arctic down through the Amazon. Let that sink in for a second. A small child buried in central Siberia 24,000 years ago carried genetic threads connecting him to two directions, at once, one reaching west toward Europe, the other reaching all the way into a continent that, as far as anyone knew, no human being had set foot on yet. Scientists now believe the ancestors of Native Americans were not one people quietly walking east. They were the product of at least two entirely different populations meeting, mingling, and eventually becoming one. One branch carried this westward so-called ancient North Eurasian ancestry, tied to that boy from Lake Baikal. The other branch descended from populations further east and south, closer in ancestry, to early East Asian groups. Somewhere in the rugged Altai mountains of southern Siberia, best estimates suggest these two very different lineages crossed paths, and whatever happened next, it worked out well enough that their descendants would eventually become the founding population of two entire continents. Funny enough, that exact same mountain range would later hand scientists another jaw-dropping surprise: a tiny fragment of finger bone that turned out to belong to an entirely unknown branch of ancient humans nobody had ever identified before. But that particular rabbit hole deserves its own evening, not a rushed detour tonight. There's something almost poetic about that meeting point if you sit with it long enough. Long before anyone had a word for a nation or a border or a passport, two groups of people who looked different spoke differently, and carried entirely separate histories on their backs still found a way to fold into one shared future. In a strange way, it is the same basic blending that tens of thousands of years later would go on to build countries like the one many of you watching this are probably sitting in right now, places stitched together out of dozens of different peoples who arrive from every direction imaginable. It seems humanity has been quietly practicing that particular trick for a very long time. Here's a figure worth sitting with. Depending on exactly how researchers calculate it, somewhere between about 14 and 38% of Native American ancestry traces directly back to this ancient North Eurasian lineage, with plenty of studies landing close to a third. Which means if you ever meet someone whose family has deep indigenous roots anywhere across the Americas, a real measurable piece of their ancestry likely traces back to a small child buried in Siberia thousands of years before either the Egyptian pyramids or the invention of writing. It also finally answered a puzzle that had frustrated researchers for generations. A handful of very old skeletons found scattered across different sites in the Americas over the decades had features that never quite matched the assumption of a purely East Asian origin, sparking years of confused debate, and honestly no small amount of academic arguing. Once the ancient North Eurasian piece of the puzzle clicked into place, Those strange outlying skeletons suddenly made a great deal more sense. Do you ever stop to think about how many completely different, unrelated groups of people had to mix, and quite literally fall for each other, just so that any one of us could exist today? I think about that more than I probably should. Every single one of us is walking proof of some ancient, improbable meeting, so that settles who these ancestors actually were. But knowing who someone is has never told us the whole story of where they went or exactly how they got there. And this next part is where things get properly strange. For most of the last century, the accepted theory was almost embarrassingly simple. People crossed Beringia, then walked south through a corridor that supposedly opened up between two enormous ice sheets, covering what is now Western Canada, arriving in the interior of North America, in time to leave behind a very distinctive style of stone spear point, first discovered near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, back in the 1930s. For decades, this idea, often nicknamed Clovis First, was not treated like a hypothesis waiting to be tested. It was treated almost like settled fact, taught confidently in classrooms for 2 full generations, with very little room left in the conversation for anyone who disagreed. Then a Chilean site quietly blew the whole timeline apart. At a place called Monteverde on the southern coast of Chile, archaeologists uncovered the remains of an ancient settlement complete with wooden hut frames, tools, and even preserved plant matter dated to roughly 14,500 years ago. That may not sound especially shocking on its own until you remember 2 things. First, that date is close to 1,000 years older than the supposed first arrival of the Clovis culture far to the north. Second, Monteverde sits about as far from the Bering Strait as it is physically possible to travel, while remaining on dry land practically at the opposite end of 2 entire continents. For people to have walked the interior route, cleared the ice-free corridor and made it all the way down to the southern tip of South America, in time to leave behind a site that the math simply refused to work. One frustrated researcher later joked that the old theory did not just spring a leak. It went down with the ship entirely. So if walking straight down the middle of the continent does not add up, how did people get there so quickly? The leading answer today involves something most people never picture when they imagine ancient migration: boats. Researchers now widely support what's often called the Kelp Highway idea. The theory suggests that early travellers moved south not by trekking blindly through unfamiliar interior wilderness, but by following the coastline itself, hugging the edge of the Pacific in small watercraft, harvesting food from dense unbroken kelp forests that stretched almost continuously along the shore from the coast of Japan across the rim of the Pacific, all the way down toward Baja California and beyond. Those kelp forests functioned almost like a familiar food-rich corridor floating on the water, offering fish, shellfish, and marine mammals in roughly similar forms the entire distance, so travelers never had to gamble on completely unfamiliar food sources as they moved. Think about that for a moment. Instead of one single unbroken wall of unfamiliar wilderness stretching endlessly ahead of them, these travelers essentially had the same grocery store, so to speak, laid out along the entire coastline, just with slightly different aisles the further they went. Would you rather march blind through frozen unmapped forest, or paddle along a coast where you already knew exactly what kind of fish, shellfish and seaweed waited for you around the next headland? Framed that way, the choice hardly seems difficult at all, and it turns out Monteverde backs this theory up beautifully. Buried among the ruins of that ancient settlement, researchers found the remains of 9 separate species of seaweed, some apparently used for food, others possibly for medicine. These were not people stumbling blindly into an unfamiliar landscape. They arrived already carrying deep practical knowledge of the sea. Now here is where the story gets almost impossibly vivid. In the southern New Mexico desert inside a place called White Sands National Park, sits a vast pale landscape of gypsum sand dunes, so bright and blinding under the sun that early visitors reportedly mistook the dunes for snow from a distance. Thousands of years ago, though, this bone-dry basin used to hold a shallow Ice Age lake, and along its muddy shoreline dozens of ancient footprints were pressed into that mud, and almost like a photograph, frozen mid-moment preserved down through the ages, researchers eventually dated these tracks using seeds from an ancient aquatic plant found in the same soil layers, and the results, later confirmed by two completely independent dating methods, placed the footprints at somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. Which means these are not footprints from after the Ice Age ended. These were left in the mud during the coldest, harshest peak of the entire glacial period, back when most scientists assumed the interior of North America was still locked away behind walls of ice. And these are not just anonymous scuff marks either. One trackway appears to follow a woman carrying a small child, the toddler's tiny footprints occasionally vanishing from the mud completely, only for the mother's own prints to grow visibly deeper and wider each time, as if she had simply picked the little one up and carried them onward for a stretch, before setting them back down to walk again. Other tracks nearby appear to follow a small group moving purposefully alongside enormous rounded footprints belonging to a giant ground sloth, suggesting hunters trailing dangerous prey across that same ancient lakeshore. I keep coming back to that image of the mother and her child. 23,000 years is such an enormous number that it stops meaning much of anything but a tired parent shifting a sleepy toddler onto their hip for a while. That part needs no translation across time at all. That part any of us would recognize instantly. What do you think you would have been chasing if you were the one walking that ancient shoreline? Hunger, probably. Warmth, almost certainly. Maybe just some quiet, stubborn feeling that better ground was waiting somewhere past the next bend in the coast. None of these people were trying to make history. They were not thinking about continents or timelines or academic papers written by strangers tens of thousands of years in the future. They were following food, chasing warmer ground, carrying their children, and simply trying to get through one more day. And somewhere along hundreds of small, unremarkable days like that, one spread out across generations and both entire continents, they quietly became the ancestors of everyone who would eventually build cities, empires, and cultures from the tip of Alaska to the southern edge of Chile. Which brings us to something worth sitting with. If people were already this far south, already leaving footprints in New Mexico mud, while the Ice Age was still at its absolute coldest, that means an enormous number of their relatives were still living back where we left them last up in Beringia itself, completely unaware that some of their own extended family had already made it thousands of miles beyond the horizon. Two branches of the very same family tree, one already testing the edges of a brand new world, the other still waiting out the cold on a grassland that before too long the rising sea would begin quietly erasing beneath the water for good, and that rising water was not some distant gentle event happening somewhere far off in the background. For the people still living on Beringia, it was slow enough to ignore for a while, and then one particular generation suddenly impossible to ignore at all. What that final flooding actually looked like and what it meant for the families who woke up one day to find their world had quietly become an island is where this story turns next. There's a particular kind of ending that never announces itself in advance. No single dramatic moment, no line drawn in the sand you could point to later and say that was the day everything changed. Just water patiently doing what water always does, creeping a little further inland with every passing season, until one ordinary morning, the old way to walk between two continents simply was not there anymore. Nobody rang a bell. Nobody wrote the date down. The door just quietly stopped being a door, For a long time, researchers argued over exactly when that ending happened, and honestly, they are still arguing about the finer details today. Sediment cores pulled from deep beneath the Arctic seafloor pointed to somewhere around 11,500 years ago as the moment the Bering Strait finally fully opened. But other clues, things like the sudden appearance of certain ocean species on both sides of the strait at roughly the same time, suggested the water had already broken through nearly 2,000 years earlier than that. For a while, these two sets of evidence flatly contradicted each other, which is always an uncomfortable place for a scientific field to sit. Eventually, researchers built detailed models tracking exactly how the enormous ice sheets covering what's now Western Canada, sheets so massive they had names of their own, the Cordilleran and the western half of the Laurentide, melted and retreated over several thousand years. What they found was not one single flood, but something closer to two separate acts of the same slow drowning, stretched out across roughly 1,300 years, somewhere between about 13,000 and 11,500 years ago. Two pulses of rising water, not one. Mystery solved, more or less, though I suspect a handful of stubborn researchers somewhere are still emailing each other about the exact details as we speak. Here's where the story gets a little more humbling for the scientist involved, myself included, if we're being honest about how research actually works. There's a particularly famous, well-documented event in Earth's climate history called Meltwater Pulse number 1A, when global sea levels shot upward by something like 50 to 65 feet in under 300 years, an almost unthinkable rate of change by any geological measure. For years, the assumption inside the research community was straightforward. Surely this was the event that finally drowned the Bering land bridge. It was famous. It was dramatic. It fit the story everyone already wanted to tell. Except when scientists finally checked the actual sea level record preserved in sediment specifically around the Bering Strait itself, the numbers simply refused to cooperate. That particular famous pulse did not match what happened locally at all. The true flooding of Beringia turned out to be a separate later event entirely tied to different ice sheets, melting in a different pattern. An entire assumption repeated confidently for years in papers and conference talks quietly turned out to be wrong the moment somebody actually checked the local evidence instead of borrowing the global headline. A geophysicist named Pico, who worked on the study, untangling this whole mess, later admitted that pretty much everyone in the field had simply assumed the timing lined up right up until someone finally sat down and tested it properly against the local record. I find that oddly comforting in a strange way. Even careful credentialed scientists occasionally grab the tidiest available explanation and run with it a little too quickly. It's a very human mistake to make. The land doesn't actually care how convenient a theory sounds. So let's talk about what this slow ending actually felt like for anyone still living through it. The modern Bering Strait, the narrow channel of ocean now separating Russia and Alaska, measures roughly 53 miles across at its narrowest point, and drops to a depth of close to 170 feet. That entire distance, that whole stretch of cold churning water, used to be solid walkable ground. Try picturing that for a second. Imagine standing on your own front porch and watching, not overnight, but slowly across the span of a few lifetimes as the horizon itself dissolved into open ocean. Because that is roughly the pace we are talking about here. Not a flood arriving in a single terrifying afternoon, something closer to a tide that never quite goes back out, retreating a little less every season, until one particular grandmother somewhere in that vanishing landscape could likely have pointed to a stretch of coastline and told her grandchildren quite matter-of-factly that her own mother used to walk her dogs out there, and it did not happen evenly either. As the water crept steadily inward, It slowly carved what remained of Beringia into two separate shrinking patches of usable ground, one clinging to the Siberian side, the other to the Alaskan side, with a widening channel of grey water slowly stretching the distance between them. For a stretch of years before the final breach, someone standing on one shrinking edge could likely have watched the opposite shore fade a little further into the haze each season, long before the ocean ever fully closed the gap for good. Have you ever watched a place you loved slowly change into something you no longer recognized? Maybe not an entire continent disappearing under the ocean, obviously, but a childhood neighborhood, a coastline, a family farm sold off and paved over. There's a particular quiet grief in watching something vanish gradually, one small piece at a time rather than all at once. I imagine whatever version of that feeling existed 12,000 years ago was not so different from the version we still carry around today. It's strange in a way to realize that families living along plenty of coastlines right now are quietly watching a smaller, faster version of this exact same story play out again, waterlines creeping further inland year after year. History rarely repeats itself exactly, but every so often it seems to hum the same old tune in a slightly different key. Now here's the part of this story that goes considerably bigger than one flooded strip of coastline. When the Bering Strait finally broke open for good, it did something the people living through it could not possibly have understood at the time. It reconnected the Pacific Ocean to the Arctic Ocean for the first time since the Ice Age began, allowing an entirely new current of water to start flowing north. And that water flow appears to have played a real role in one of the strangest climate events in recent geological history, a period researchers now call the Younger Dryas. Picture this. The planet had already spent thousands of years slowly warming out of the deepest freeze of the Ice Age, glaciers retreating, grasslands turning green, and then rather abruptly, somewhere around 12,900 years ago, the whole planet, or at least the entire northern half of it, plunged straight back toward Ice Age conditions again, and stayed there for close to 1,200 years. Temperatures in some regions dropped several degrees within mere decades, fast enough that it would have been noticeable within a single human lifetime. Pollen records from lake beds across Europe and North America show forests retreating and cold-tolerant plants rushing back, in almost as if someone had quietly rewound the climate clock by several thousand years, right in the middle of everyone's collective sigh of relief. Researchers still debate the full list of causes, but a leading explanation points to exactly this kind of meltwater event: enormous volumes of fresh, cold water pouring into the ocean and disrupting the deep currents that normally carry warmth around the globe, essentially throwing a wrench into the planet's own heating system, which means it's entirely possible that the very same flood that severed the walking path between two continents also helped plunge much of the northern hemisphere back into a frozen near Ice Age world for well over 1,000 years afterward. A regional flood with planetary consequences. Not exactly the kind of detail that makes it into most grade school textbooks, but it probably should. It is strange to think that a fairly narrow, unremarkable stretch of ocean, one most people today couldn't even locate on a blank map, may have quietly reshaped weather patterns for an entire hemisphere. And there is one more consequence worth sitting with before we move any further. Once that land bridge disappeared beneath the waves for good, anyone hoping to travel between these two continents again could no longer simply walk across. From this point forward, any future crossing heading in either direction would require real boats, real seafaring skill, and no small amount of courage, which quietly makes whatever happened next in this story considerably more impressive than a casual stroll across frozen ground ever could have been. And once that water settled into its current shape, once the strait fully became the strait, the story that most people accepted for the better part of a century was refreshingly deceptively simple. Two continents now cleanly separated by open ocean, with populations on either side drifting apart, isolated from one another for thousands upon thousands of years, until European ships eventually reconnected the hemispheres by pure accident. Clean, tidy, easy to put in a textbook, which, if you have been with me since the very beginning of tonight's story, you already know is not quite the whole truth. Some currents still managed to flow the wrong way across that supposedly closed door more than once, in ways almost nobody suspected until fairly recently. Today, if you stand on the shore near the narrowest crossing point and look out across the water on a clear day, you can actually see land on the other side, close enough that it hardly looks like two separate continents at all. Sitting almost exactly in the middle of that gap are two small islands barely 2.5 miles apart from each other, one belonging to Russia, the other to the United States. On a clear day, residents on the smaller island can look directly across the water and see the larger one sitting right there, practically within shouting distance. And because of exactly where the international dateline happens, to run slicing directly through the water between them, those two islands technically sit a full calendar day apart from each other. Step outside on one island, and depending on which direction you're facing, you're either looking a full day into the future or staring straight back into a day that has already come and gone. I have always found that detail almost unbearably poetic. Two pieces of land close enough to wave at each other, and yet on paper existing in entirely different days. It feels like the whole story of this place condensed down into a single strange little fact. Distance, it turns out, was never really the point. Something else entirely kept these two shores apart for so long. If you had been standing on that narrow gap back when it was still solid ground, which direction do you think you would have looked back toward everything familiar or forward toward everything you had never seen? I like to think most of us would say forward. I suspect most of us would actually turn around. So the water won in the end. The bridge disappeared. And for thousands of years afterward, two branches of the very same family, separated more by a stretch of cold water than by anything resembling real distance, quietly built entirely different lives on opposite shores, unaware of just how much they still had in common. On one side, a population that would eventually spread across two entire continents, building everything from desert cities to rainforest villages. And on the other side, a much smaller group of people who simply stayed exactly where they had always been, adapting to one of the harshest, most unforgiving coastlines on the entire planet. Their story, the story of the people who never left in the first place, is easy to overlook next to all this talk of migration and discovery. It rarely gets its own chapter in the textbooks the way the crossing itself does. But honestly, staying put through conditions like that took just as much courage as walking into the unknown ever did, if not considerably more, and it deserves a proper telling of its own. Because while one branch of this family was busy spreading across two brand new continents, learning to farm, to build, to name rivers and mountains that had never had names before, the other branch was quietly mastering something entirely different. How to survive generation after generation on a coastline that offered almost nothing for free. No forest to speak of, no gentle growing season. Just ice wind and a narrow strip of grey water separating them from a world their own ancestors had once walked across on foot. What that life actually looked like, and just how much resilience it took to build an entire way of living out of almost nothing at all, is a story that deserves its own careful telling. So who exactly were these people who never left? It's a fair question, and honestly, one that most history books skip over entirely, rushing straight past them on the way to somewhere else. Three closely related peoples ended up sharing this particular corner of the earth, the Chukchi, the Koryak, and the Itelmen, all speaking languages from the same small ancient family, a family found nowhere else on the planet. Their homeland stretched across the Chukotka Peninsula, and down into Kamchatka, a landscape of tundra volcanoes and coastlines so remote that even other Siberians considered it the edge of the known world. Winters here could stretch on for the better part of 9 months, the sun barely clearing the horizon, and summer, when it finally arrived, felt almost like an apology, brief green and gone again far too quickly. And within that one small cultural family, there were broadly speaking 2 very different ways of surviving out there, depending entirely on which direction you happened to face when you stepped outside your home each morning. If you faced inland toward the open tundra, your entire existence revolved around reindeer, not owning them the way a farmer owns cattle behind a fence, but following them, moving your entire household wherever the herd needed to go next, sometimes covering enormous distances across a single season. Home for these communities was a structure called a yaranga, a rounded dome-shaped tent built from reindeer hide stretched over a wooden frame with a smaller fur-lined sleeping chamber tucked inside it like a warm little room within a colder one. You could take the whole thing apart, load it onto sleds and rebuild it somewhere else within hours. It is essentially one of the most efficient portable homes ever designed by any culture on Earth, refined over countless generations of trial and error in a climate that offered absolutely zero room for mistakes. If you faced the coast instead, life looked completely different. These communities settled in villages along the shore and built their entire world around the ocean, hunting walrus seal, and when the community was skilled and brave enough, whales. This required an entirely separate set of technology. Skin boats framed with driftwood or whale rib and stretched tight with walrus or seal hide, light enough to carry yet sturdy enough to survive open Arctic water and the occasional very unhappy walrus. Coastal families originally built partly underground homes reinforced with whalebone, though many eventually adopted the same yaranga style used inland, just covered in tougher walrus hide, instead of reindeer skin, because apparently even a very different lifestyle can still recognize a good idea when it sees one. Coastal hunting peoples along this stretch of the Bering Sea developed one particularly clever piece of technology, worth pausing on a truly waterproof outer garment, sewn not from any fabric but from the carefully cleaned and dried intestines of sea mammals, stitched together along seams so tight and so precise that almost no water could pass through them at all. Long before anyone in Europe had invented modern waterproof rain gear, hunters out here were already paddling through freezing surf completely dry, underneath wearing coats made from an animal that had quite literally given every last part of itself to keep the next generation warm and alive. Here's something I find quietly remarkable about all of this. These were not primitive people scraping by on luck. Every piece of clothing, every seam in every boot, every carved harpoon point represented generations of accumulated specialized knowledge, refined against a landscape that would kill you within hours if you got the details wrong. There was no room here for approximate solutions. A slightly imperfect boot seam did not mean cold toes. It could mean frostbite, and frostbite out there could mean considerably worse. Further south on the volcanic spine of the Kamchatka Peninsula itself lived the third people in this small family, the Atelmen. Their world looked a little gentler on the surface, at least by comparison. Kamchatka is scattered with active volcanoes, hot springs and rivers so thick with salmon during the annual runs that early visitors reportedly described the water itself as looking as though it were boiling with fish. The Atelmen built their lives around that seasonal abundance, drying and storing salmon to last through the long winter and living in more settled villages than their nomadic neighbours to the north, since a landscape this generous, at least for a few months each year, rewarded staying put. They even found practical uses for the volcanic geothermal heat scattered across their homeland, something few other peoples anywhere in the Arctic world had the natural luxury of relying on. Their spiritual life reflected that same deep practical intimacy with the natural world around them. Both reindeer herding and coastal communities held ceremonies thanking the animals whose lives sustained their own, treating the relationship between hunter and hunted less like conquest and more like a kind of ongoing negotiation, one that demanded respect on both sides. Dancers at these gatherings would often imitate the animals themselves, walruses, reindeer, seabirds blurring the line between the performer and the creature being honoured. It was less superstition if you actually sit with it, and more an entire philosophy of living one built around the idea that nothing you take from the world around you should ever be taken for granted. Do you ever wonder what it would feel like to live somewhere your own survival depended on truly respecting the animals around you, rather than simply assuming the grocery store shelves will restock themselves, the way most of us quietly take for granted today? I think we lost something valuable somewhere along the way, even if most of us wouldn't trade our heated houses to get it back. Have you ever noticed how easy it is for outsiders to label something like this primitive, simply because it doesn't come wrapped in the same technology we happen to be used to? I think that word says a great deal more about the person using it than about the culture it's describing. Which brings us to a chapter of this story that I suspect almost nobody watching tonight has ever heard before, and it might be my personal favourite detail in this entire history. Starting in the middle of the 17th century, Russian Cossacks had been sweeping steadily eastward across the entire breadth of Siberia, an almost unstoppable wave of conquest that swallowed up one indigenous group after another, collecting fur tribute and territory as they went. By the time they reached the edge of the Chukchi homeland, they had grown thoroughly confident in their own inevitability. Then they ran directly into a wall. The Chukchi refused to be conquered, not through some dramatic single battle, but through a full century and a half of grinding, relentless resistance. The first serious military expedition against them in the year 1701 ended badly for the Russians. More expeditions followed in the years after each one, meeting fierce, coordinated resistance across a landscape the Chukchi knew intimately, and the Russians did not know at all. War flared up again in 1729 when the Chukchi defeated an entire expedition and killed its commanding officer. Part of their advantage came down to knowing exactly how to fight on their own terms. Rather than meeting Russian forces in open formal battle, where superior weapons and numbers might have mattered more, Chukchi fighters relied on speed, mobility, and an intimate knowledge of a landscape that swallowed strangers whole. They struck quickly in small groups, then vanished back into the tundra before any retaliation could catch up with them. Warriors also wore layered armour stitched together from walrus hide. Walrus tusk, reindeer rib bone, and sometimes whalebone light enough to move quickly and yet sturdy enough to turn aside an arrow or a poorly aimed blade. It was essentially homegrown battlefield engineering built entirely from materials the tundra and the sea happened to provide. Eventually, command of the campaign fell to a particularly ruthless officer named Dmitry Pavlutsky, whose tactics grew increasingly brutal as the war dragged on without producing the victory St. Petersburg kept demanding. But the Chukchi studied his methods carefully, and in 1747 they turned his own tactics back against him. They staged an elaborate trap, luring his forces out with what looked like an easy target, and ambushed him decisively. Pavlutsky did not survive the encounter. By this point, the war had cost the Russian government well over 1 million rubles, an almost absurd sum for the era, while the tribute they had actually managed to collect barely scraped past 30,000. Even an empire has a breaking point for bad math. Somewhere in St. Petersburg, some poor treasury official was almost certainly staring at those two numbers side by side, wondering how on earth to explain this particular line item to anyone above him. In the 1760s, St. Petersburg finally admitted defeat in every practical sense, abandoned their fort along the Anadyr River, and quietly withdrew. What followed was not surrender, but something considerably more interesting, a negotiated peace between something resembling equals. In 1779, the Chukchi formally accepted Russian citizenship on paper in exchange for trade access, and a guarantee that military campaigns against them would stop for good. In practice, they kept governing themselves exactly as they always had. Nearly 80 years later, official Russian legal code was still describing the Chukchi in so many words as people who had never actually been fully conquered, a strikingly honest admission for any empire to put in writing. And well into the early 20th century, plenty of Chukchi families reportedly had no real idea they were even considered subjects of the Russian crown at all. I love that detail more than I probably should. An empire that at its peak stretched across 11 time zones, an empire that would go on to topple kingdoms and redraw borders across half the planet, quite literally, could not finish the job here, not through lack of trying, and eventually just decided negotiating with a free people made a great deal more sense than continuing to lose to one. It also completely upends a lazy assumption plenty of us grew up with somewhere along the way, the idea that indigenous peoples across history were simply passive, waiting quietly to be discovered, conquered, or written about by someone else. The Chukchi were never anyone's footnote. If anything, for about 150 years they were the ones writing the terms. Most stories of colonial expansion that make it into Western textbooks tend to end a certain way, with the empire eventually winning sooner or later through sheer weight of numbers and technology. This is one of the rare, quiet exceptions, and I think that alone makes it worth remembering. There is one more small detail I want to leave you with before we move on, because it captures something about this culture that easily gets lost. The Chukchi language belongs to its own tiny ancient family, unrelated to almost anything else spoken anywhere on the planet. And remarkably, it became one of the only languages in that part of the world to independently develop its own original writing system, invented by a Chukchi reindeer herder in the 20th century, without any outside help or influence at all. A herder working alone on the tundra, quietly solving a problem that entire academic institutions elsewhere have spent centuries fumbling through. So this was the world waiting on the far shore long after the bridge between two continents had disappeared beneath the waves. Fiercely independent people brilliantly adapted to one of the harshest coastlines on the planet, hunting whales from boats stitched together by hand, defeating empires without ever building a single cannon of their own. Not a footnote to someone else's migration story. A whole civilization quietly thriving on its own terms, on what most outsiders would have written off as an empty, uninhabitable edge of the map, and somewhere within their own bloodlines, quietly waiting to be discovered by scientists thousands of years later, sat the answer to a mystery nobody in that Uranga or that skin boat could possibly have imagined. Because while these coastal hunters were perfecting the art of building small, sturdy boats capable of surviving open Arctic water hunting animals, many times their own size, with nothing but courage, patience and hand-carved tools, that very same maritime skill was about to matter far more than any of them could have known. It was about to carry at least a few of their distant relatives on a journey back across the very water their ancestors had once left behind for good thousands of years earlier in the opposite direction. Somewhere around 5,000 years ago, give or take a couple of centuries either direction, a small group of people stood on a shoreline in what is now western Alaska, looking out across open water toward a coastline none of them had ever personally seen, and decided to get in a boat anyway. Behind them lay everything, familiar solid ground, known hunting territory, the graves of parents and grandparents. Ahead lay fog current, and a story passed down about a homeland none of them could have actually remembered firsthand. No map existed to guide them. No one waiting on the far shore even knew they were coming. To understand why that decision matters so much, we need to rewind the tape just slightly first. After the old land bridge disappeared beneath the waves for good, the descendants of the people who had crossed into the Americas kept spreading, kept settling, kept becoming more and more genetically distinct from the relatives they had left behind in Asia. But not every single group pushed deep into the continental interior. Some stayed close to the coast, adapting to a cold, resource-rich stretch of shoreline, running along what's now western and northern Alaska, a landscape of driftwood sea ice, and migrating herds of marine mammals thick enough to build an entire civilization around. Geneticists refer to this particular group today as the Paleo-Eskimo population, and their story turns out to be considerably stranger and considerably more important than that fairly bland academic label suggests. Roughly 4,800 years ago, this Paleo-Eskimo population ran into and mixed with groups of people already living further south, populations descended from that earlier first American migration we've already spent so much time with tonight. And this is where the story splits cleanly into two very different branches, according to detailed genetic research published in recent years. What strikes me about this particular split is how differently it played out for the two groups involved, given that they started from essentially the same starting point. Same rough time window, same general region, same basic set of ancestral ingredients, and yet one branch ended up scattering itself across an entire hemisphere of languages and cultures, while the other quietly tucked itself away and stayed remarkably still for thousands of years afterward. History rarely splits people down some neat, predictable line. Sometimes two branches of the exact same family simply end up living completely different lives, for reasons that boil down to little more than which direction someone happened to be facing on a particular morning. Do you ever wonder how differently your own family's story might have unfolded if one particular relative generations back had simply turned left instead of right? One branch of that mixing produced the ancestors of what we now call the Nardini language family, a huge and widespread group of indigenous peoples whose descendants would eventually stretch from interior Alaska down through western Canada. Genetically speaking, that branch carries somewhere between 30 and 40% Paleo-Eskimo ancestry, blended together with a much larger share from those earlier first American populations. Here's a detail about that Nadine branch that still catches people off guard when they hear it for the first time. Linguists have traced that same family of languages all the way down into the deserts of the American Southwest, to the Navajo and Apache peoples whose ancestors are now believed to have migrated south from the subarctic, likely sometime around 800 years ago, carrying pieces of a language family whose roots trace directly back to this ancient mixing event up in Alaska. Picture that for a moment. A shared linguistic thread connecting people hunting caribou in the Alaskan interior to people building lives among the Red Rock Canyons of Arizona, both branches of the exact same family tree that started forming right here thousands of years earlier and thousands of miles away. The second branch mixed a little differently, ending up with something closer to half Paleo-Eskimo ancestry, and became the ancestors of the Eskimo Aleut language family, the broad group of cultures that would eventually include the Inuit, the Yupik, and the Aleut peoples scattered across a jaw-dropping stretch of the Arctic from Siberia all the way to Greenland. A single connected linguistic and cultural thread wrapped almost entirely around the top of the planet. Here's where those two branches part ways in a way I find quietly fascinating. One branch, the ancestors of the Aleut people, specifically headed further out along the island chain that still bears their name today, eventually settling into a life of near total isolation out among the Aleutian Islands. They stayed there, Geneticists can actually see this in the data because modern Aleut populations show almost none of the Chukotko-Kamchatkan ancestry that shows up so strongly elsewhere in this story, a kind of genetic fingerprint proving they simply never went back. It's almost eerie in a way how clearly a single choice made thousands of years ago still shows up so plainly in living people today, like a decision that never stopped echoing. But the other branch did something different entirely. Some of these people turned north following the curve of the coastline up toward the narrowest crossing point of the Bering Strait, and then at some point along that journey, whether gradually over several generations or through one particular deliberate choice, we will likely never fully reconstruct, they turned west and paddled home. Have you ever wondered what it actually takes for an entire community to decide to leave everything settled and familiar behind and go looking for a place their own grandparents once called home based on nothing but old stories and a direction to paddle in? I think about that a lot more than the raw archaeology alone would probably justify. Realistically, it likely wasn't one dramatic single voyage, the kind of thing you could paint on a museum wall, with everyone looking heroically toward the horizon. Coastal hunting peoples along this stretch of water had almost certainly been following seasonal herds of walrus and seal back and forth across parts of the strait for generations already, without necessarily thinking of it as migration at all. It was simply where the animals went, and where the animals went, the hunters followed. Somewhere within that ordinary repeated rhythm of chasing dinner across the water season after season, a few of those seasonal trips likely stretched a little further than usual, lingered a little longer on the far shore, and eventually turned into something more permanent. History rarely announces its biggest turning points with fireworks. Most of the time it just quietly forgets to turn back. I doubt it was purely sentiment driving this either, if we're being honest about how human communities actually behave. A growing population along one stretch of coastline eventually runs up against a hard limit on how many walruses and seals that same coastline can reliably provide. When resources tighten, people move the Zest story that plays out across nearly every chapter of human history in nearly every corner of the globe. Maybe it started as pure practicality, more mouths to feed than one shoreline could support, and only later, once families had settled back into that older homeland, did it start to feel like something closer to a homecoming. Necessity and meaning have a funny way of arriving together, even when they didn't start out related at all. The boats that made this possible deserve a proper mention here, because they were nothing like the small one-person kayaks most people picture when they hear the word skin boat. For journeys like this, coastal hunting cultures across the Bering Sea built a different style entirely. A wide-open vessel stretched over a driftwood frame with walrus hide, large enough to carry an entire extended family, along with dogs' tools and enough dried meat to survive the crossing. Paddled by a full crew working in rhythm, a well-built version of one of these boats could reportedly cover a remarkably impressive distance in a single-day weather, and current permitting, which mattered enormously, given how quickly conditions out on that particular stretch of ocean could turn dangerous. Steering one of these across open current heavy water through fog thick enough to swallow the horizon whole required a level of navigational skill that honestly deserves far more respect than it usually gets in most history books. No compass, no charts, just wind current, the position of familiar stars, and generations of accumulated hard-won knowledge passed down entirely by word of mouth. Now here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. How do scientists even begin to date something like this? An event with no written record, no monument, nothing carved into stone anywhere. The answer involves a rather elegant trick tucked inside our own genetic code. Every time two populations mix, the resulting blend of genetic material doesn't stay perfectly scrambled forever. Over each new generation, the long stretches of genetic material inherited from each parent get shuffled and broken into slightly shorter pieces, almost like a deck of two different coloured cards being repeatedly cut and reshuffled together. By carefully measuring the average length of those still intact blocks of ancestry in people alive today, researchers can essentially count backward generation by generation to estimate roughly when the original mixing event actually happened. It's a bit like being able to guess how many times a photograph has been copied, purely by measuring how blurry each successive copy has become. The shorter and more thoroughly scrambled those genetic blocks are today, the further back in time that original mixing must have taken place. Using exactly this method, researchers landed on that same window somewhere in the neighbourhood of 5,000 years ago, for when Paleo-Eskimo ancestry first mixed into the population living back in Chukotka, which lines up beautifully with everything else. This story has already shown us the flooded land bridge, the isolated Aleutian branch, and eventually, thousands of years later, those three unassuming skeletons pulled from a quiet riverbank in Kamchatka that we began this whole story with. I want to sit with that connection for just a second because it's the kind of thing that gives me actual chills, and I don't say that lightly. Everything we've covered tonight, the vanished grassland, the flooded strait, the fiercely independent people who built entire lives out of walrus hide and reindeer bone, all of it was quietly leading toward this exact moment. A small group of people in a boat choosing to go home. It also completely reframes something we casually accept as fact far too often. We tend to picture ancient migration as a permanent one-directional decision made once and never revisited. But the people in this story treated the ocean less like a locked door and more like a long, difficult hallway, one they were willing to walk back down whenever circumstances called for it. Home for them was clearly never just a place they had left behind. It stayed something worth returning to generations after anyone still living could have personally remembered why. And honestly, isn't that a fairly familiar feeling even now? Plenty of us carry around some quiet pull toward a place we've never actually lived simply because our own family once did. And once this new population settled back into life along the Siberian coast, they did not simply blend in quietly and disappear into the existing culture around them. They brought something new with them, tools, traditions, and an entirely different relationship with the sea, one shaped by generations spent adapting to a different shore. Combined with what was already there, this backflow of people and ideas eventually gave rise to something entirely new, an archaeological culture that would leave behind some of the most extraordinary carved artwork anywhere in the ancient Arctic world, ivory pieces so detailed and so strange that when they were first uncovered, researchers struggled to even agree on what half of the carvings were even supposed to represent, or what kind of people could have carried both the skill and the patience to make them, what the culture actually looked like. The art it left scattered across the tundra, and the way it quietly stitched two continents back together through nothing more than craftsmanship and memory, is a story that deserves the space to unfold properly, rather than being rushed through in the last few minutes of this one. So let's actually go looking for what these returning travellers left behind, because the evidence, once you know where to look, is honestly spectacular. Not buried in some dusty footnote of an academic journal either. Sitting quite literally in the ground along this same coastline, waiting patiently for over 1,000 years to be noticed. Along the coast of the Chukchi Peninsula, near two small archaeological sites called Ekven and Yulin, researchers began pulling something remarkable out of the frozen ground starting in the middle of the last century. Burial after burial, cemetery after cemetery, all sitting almost embarrassingly close to the water, tucked onto low hills overlooking beaches, where material still occasionally erodes straight out of the banks and tumbles down onto the sand below, as if the past simply refuses to stay buried quietly. In fact, when archaeologists later mapped out every single site connected to this particular culture, they realized something rather telling. Not one of them sits more than about half a mile from the ocean. Not a single one. These were not people who merely lived near the sea. Their entire universe was built facing it. Researchers eventually gave this culture a name, the Old Bering Sea culture, and its earliest traces date back to somewhere around 2,200 years ago, reaching its full flowering somewhere between roughly 1100 and 1600 years ago. And if that particular starting date sounds oddly familiar, it should. It lines up almost perfectly with the genetic window we just finished discussing a moment ago, the same rough era when that backflow population settled back into life along this coastline. Archaeology and genetics working from two completely different directions, arriving at the exact same door. One more small detail worth noticing here because it says something about how deliberately these communities chose where to live. Map out every major site connected to this culture, and you'll find them clustered suspiciously close to the largest seasonal gathering points for Pacific walrus places, where thousands of animals hauled themselves out onto the same stretch of coastline year after year like clockwork. These were not random settlements scattered along an empty shoreline. They were built with real strategic intention, planted directly beside the richest, most reliable food source this entire coastline had to offer. Here's the detail that truly stopped researchers in their tracks for the better part of a century. Successful organized whale hunting, the kind that requires coordinated crews, specialized harpoons, and enough social trust to physically depend on the people paddling next to you in open water essentially appears in this region without much of a slow, gradual build-up beforehand. One-era hunters focused mainly on walrus and seal. Then within a relatively narrow window of time, an entire fully formed whaling tradition shows up seemingly out of nowhere. For a long stretch of the last century, archaeologists honestly struggled to explain that gap. Where was the messy centuries-long trial and error you'd normally expect to find buried somewhere in the record? It simply wasn't there. Given everything else we've covered tonight, I don't think it takes much imagination to connect those dots. A population arrives from across the water, carrying an entirely different relationship with the sea, forged over generations spent hunting marine mammals along the Alaskan coastline. They settle in among people who already know these waters intimately, who already understand walrus migration patterns and ice conditions better than anyone alive today ever could. Combine those two bodies of knowledge and you don't get a slow trickle of innovation. You get something closer to an explosion. Interestingly, this wasn't a case of one culture simply erasing another and starting fresh. Researchers studying the stone tools recovered from these same layers notice something that quietly confirms everything we discussed earlier about the fiercely resourceful people who had never actually left this coastline in the first place. The toolmaking traditions show clear roots reaching back roughly 3,000 years into the local Chukchi past, long before any backflow population ever arrived. What emerged here wasn't a replacement. It was a genuine collaboration stretched out across generations between people who had stayed and people who'd returned, each side contributing exactly the piece the other was missing. Neither group on its own had quite everything needed to build what came next. It took both. And what these people built with that knowledge is quite honestly some of the most extraordinary art to survive anywhere in the ancient Arctic world, the kind of craftsmanship that frankly deserves a much larger audience than it currently gets outside a handful of specialist museum collections. Picture a walrus tusk carved not with crude simple lines, but with intricate swirling patterns of circles, dots, and flowing curves wrapping around the entire surface, almost like the ivory itself was still alive and breathing under the artist's hand. Harpoon heads, needle cases, small carved figures of polar bears and seals rendered with a level of anatomical precision that still impresses museum curators today. None of it rushed, none of it careless. Every single surface these artists touched seems to have been treated as an opportunity rather than a chore. One particular category of object recovered from these burial sites became a genuine decades-long puzzle, all on its own elegant, symmetrical wing-shaped pieces of carved ivory, often decorated more elaborately than almost anything else found at the site. For years, nobody was entirely certain what they were even for. Researchers eventually settled on the most likely explanation, that these so-called winged objects functioned as counterweights, carefully balanced onto the back end of a harpoon shaft to improve its flight and accuracy through the air. Which means someone roughly 1,500 years ago cared enough about a purely functional hunting tool to turn it into a genuine work of art, anyway spending hours on decorative detail that added absolutely nothing to how well the harpoon actually flew. Have you ever wondered why humans do that? Why we can't seem to leave anything purely functional alone without also making it beautiful? I don't think that urge is some kind of luxury add-on to survival. I think it might actually be part of what survival has always meant to us. The burials themselves tell an equally rich story. Some graves contained almost nothing at all, while others held an astonishing collection of carved ivory jewellery, made from bone, and even small wooden masks careful enough in their construction to suggest real artistic training passed down deliberately from someone to someone else. A few of those masks still show traces of paint, faint pigment clinging on after more than 1,000 years underground, hinting at faces that once meant something specific to the people who carved them, a meaning we can only guess at now. That kind of imbalance usually points toward a society with real social structure, not simply a loose collection of families surviving side by side. Researchers now believe certain individuals held genuine positions of authority within these communities, likely whaling captains who organized and led hunts, and shamans responsible for the spiritual side of that same dangerous high-stakes work. Leading a whale hunt back then wasn't just a matter of skill with a harpoon. It required someone the entire crew trusted with their lives out on open water miles from shore, chasing an animal that outweighed their entire boat many times over. And here's a detail I particularly love. Some of the graves showing this kind of spiritual authority, the tools, the ornamentation typically associated with shamanic status, belong to women. Long before certain later human societies decided spiritual leadership belonged exclusively to men, this particular Arctic culture apparently never got that memo. I find a strange sort of comfort in that. A community facing conditions this unforgiving simply couldn't afford to waste talent on the basis of who happened to be allowed to lead. Survival, it turns out, has always been a fairly efficient equalizer. Now here's where this story earns its place at the very centre of tonight's entire journey. This exact same art style, the same circles, the same dots, the same elegantly carved winged objects does not stay confined to one side of the water. Archaeologists have pulled up nearly identical pieces from sites on St. Lawrence Island and the Alaskan coastline as well, sitting directly across the strait. Same aesthetic, same technology, same burial customs. Two shores separated by open ocean sharing one unmistakable unified culture. Sit with that for a second, because I think it's easy to let a detail like this slide past without really feeling its weight. We spent an entire earlier stretch of this story talking about a flooded land bridge, a supposedly permanent boundary between two continents. And here, scattered across museum collections on both sides of that exact same water, is physical, undeniable proof that the boundary never fully held. Not culturally, not genetically. People on both shores were carving the same symbols, burying their dead with the same customs, hunting the same animals with the same specialized tools, separated by nothing but a few days of open water paddling whenever the weather allowed for the crossing. Do you ever think about how much of what connects us to distant relatives isn't blood at all, but simply the small repeated choices we never even realize we've inherited, the way we season a certain dish, the particular way we tell a joke, the specific superstition we can't quite explain but still follow anyway? I suspect these carvers were doing something similar, passing along a shared visual language across an ocean, largely without knowing they were preserving anything at all. It also quietly answers a question I imagine some of you have been sitting with since fairly early on in tonight's story. If people really did paddle back across that water, what did they actually leave behind beyond just a trace in someone's genetic code thousands of years later? The answer, it turns out, was sitting in the ground the entire time, waiting patiently in walrus ivory and whalebone for someone to finally dig it up and recognize what they were looking at. For a long time, though, recognizing it was precisely the problem. Archaeologists could see the artifacts. They could measure the similarities, compare burial styles, and note the shared symbols with genuine excitement. What they could not do, not for decades, was actually prove any of this represented real shared human ancestry, rather than simply two separate cultures that happened to independently invent similar-looking tools and similar-looking art purely by coincidence. Shared technology alone has never been solid proof of shared blood. People all over the world have independently invented remarkably similar solutions to remarkably similar problems throughout history, without ever meeting each other at all, simply because the same problem tends to produce a fairly limited set of good answers. So the ivory told part of the story and told it beautifully. But art can be borrowed. Symbols can be traded, copied, admired from a distance, and adopted without a single person from either community ever actually crossing the water themselves, proving that these two coastlines were not just culturally connected, but actually related by blood, by ancestry, by real flesh and bone family ties reaching back thousands of years, required a very different kind of evidence entirely. Something hidden far too deep inside the body to carve paint or trade away. Something that had been sitting there all along, waiting for scientists to finally develop the tools sharp enough to read it properly. That different kind of evidence had actually been sitting in laboratories for years, already quietly waiting for the right question to be asked of it. Not hidden in some remote excavation site this time, but tucked away inside ordinary vials of genetic material sitting in freezers, catalogued, labelled, and mostly ignored by anyone who didn't already know exactly what they were looking for. Back in the year 2012, a research team working out of University College London, led by a geneticist named Andrés Ruiz Linares, set out to do something considerably more ambitious than anyone had previously attempted. They wanted to reconstruct the entire migration history of the Americas using nothing but the genetic material of people alive today, stretching from communities in Canada all the way down to the very tip of Chile. On paper, that sounds simple enough. In practice, it turned into one of the messier technical puzzles in the entire field. Here's the problem they ran into almost immediately. Ever since a certain 15th century voyage across the Atlantic, followed by 500 years of colonization, forced migration, and everything that came with it, the genetic makeup of most indigenous populations across the Americas had become heavily mixed with European and African ancestry. Trying to study the original ancient migration patterns through that lens was a bit like trying to read a centuries-old letter after someone spilled coffee across half the page. The information was still technically there. You just had to figure out how to separate it from everything poured on top of it afterward. And unlike a spilled cup of coffee, this particular stain didn't sit neatly in one corner of the page, It ran straight through nearly every single line of text mixed in, generation after generation, family after family, until untangling it required tools far more precise than anything available to researchers even one generation earlier. So the team developed careful statistical methods to isolate only the segments of each person's genome that traced purely back to the original pre-contact populations of the Americas, essentially filtering out everything added over the last 5 centuries and examining only what remained underneath. Genetic material, it turns out, gets passed down in chunks not blended together like paint colours, mixing into one uniform shade. A person with mixed ancestry doesn't carry some smooth average of their different backgrounds. They carry distinct stretches of genetic code, some tracing back to one continent, some to another, sitting right alongside each other on the exact same strand. Researchers essentially had to sort through millions of these individual stretches, tagging each one by probable origin, before they could even begin asking the bigger question they actually cared about. Professor Ruiz Linares later described this kind of research as technically demanding, specifically because of how thoroughly mixed these populations had become. It required real patience and honestly a fairly stubborn kind of scientific discipline to keep peeling back layer after layer of more recent history just to get a clean look at what came before. And once they finally had that clean signal, isolated one particular result stood out from the rest, a genetic thread connecting the Norcan people and the coastal Chukchi of northeastern Siberia to what researchers now simply call, quite plainly, first American ancestry. Not a vague resemblance, not a rough regional similarity you could hand-wave away as coincidence. A specific traceable thread sitting right there in the data, refusing to be explained by anything except an actual real journey someone had once made. Now here's a question worth pausing on for a moment, because it gets right at the heart of how this entire field of detective work actually functions. How do researchers know that thread runs in one particular direction rather than the other way around? After all, both regions sit reasonably close to each other. Couldn't this ancestry simply be old, shared ground, left over from before anyone ever crossed anywhere at all, rather than proof of an actual return journey? It's a fair question, and the answer comes down to something almost embarrassingly elegant once you see it laid out plainly. Certain genetic markers appear to have formed only after populations had already settled deep into the Americas, evolving there and existing nowhere else across the entire rest of the planet, not in Europe, not in Africa, not anywhere else across the vast breadth of Asia. These markers are in a very real sense native inventions, genetic signatures with a documented birthplace. So when researchers find that exact same uniquely American signature sitting inside the genetic code of people living in Siberia, there is only one direction that signature could have possibly travelled. It could not have originated in Asia and simply carried over into the Americas because it did not exist yet at the time populations first crossed. It had to have formed in the Americas first and then made the return trip back across the water afterward. It's less like finding two people who happen to share a similar accent, and more like finding a very specific, very recent slang term, one you know for a fact was invented in one particular city, suddenly showing up in conversation on the completely opposite side of an ocean. There's only one way that word could have travelled. I love that logic, honestly. It turns something that could feel abstract and overly technical into something almost satisfyingly simple once somebody finally bothers to explain it properly. Think of it this way if it helps. Imagine finding a very particular regional recipe, one you know for a fact was invented in a small-town kitchen somewhere in the American South, showing up unexpectedly on a restaurant menu in a small fishing village in Siberia, cooked exactly the same way right down to the specific spice blend. You wouldn't assume both places simply invented the identical dish independently purely by chance. You'd assume correctly that somebody actually carried that recipe across the distance themselves. Genetic markers work on more or less the same principle, just written in a language far older and considerably harder to fake, which, if we're being honest, doesn't always happen. And this feels like exactly the right moment to address something I suspect quite a few of you watching tonight have personal experience with. Did any of you grow up with a family story about some far-off, slightly mysterious ancestor, the kind of tale that gets repeated at holiday dinners, with just enough confidence that nobody ever bothers checking if it's actually true? Every family seems to have at least one. Mine certainly did. Real research, like the kind we've walked through tonight, is essentially the extremely patient, extremely careful version of finally checking. Plenty of people have taken one of those popular at-home ancestry tests by now, spitting into a small tube, mailing it off, and waiting a few weeks for a colourful pie chart claiming to explain exactly what percentage of you comes from where. I think those tests are honestly a lot of fun, and for a lot of families they've opened up real meaningful conversations about heritage that might never have happened otherwise. But there's a common misunderstanding worth clearing up here, since we've spent this entire evening talking about exactly this kind of science. Those consumer tests are not doing the same kind of work as the academic research we've been discussing tonight. Commercial companies compare your genetic material against a reference panel built from other customers and public datasets, then run a statistical model estimating which regions your ancestry most closely resembles. That is a fundamentally different exercise than sequencing an actual 24,000-year-old skeleton and directly comparing ancient genetic material against ancient genetic material. Consumer results can shift meaningfully over time, sometimes by a noticeable percentage, purely because the reference database quietly grew larger or got recalibrated behind the scenes, not because your actual ancestry changed one single bit. A precise-sounding number like 11% from one particular region often carries a far wider margin of uncertainty underneath the surface than the clean, confident pie chart ever really lets on. It's a bit like asking 3 different tailors to estimate your height using only your shadow at 3 different times of day. Each one will hand you back a perfectly confident, perfectly specific number. None of those numbers will be identical, and none of them are exactly lying to you either. They're all doing their honest best with an imperfect tool measuring something real through an indirect method that will never quite match the precision the final printout seems to promise. Have you ever gotten one of those results back and felt a little surprised? Maybe even a little confused by a percentage that didn't quite match the family stories you grew up hearing? You are absolutely not alone in that, and it almost certainly does not mean either the test or the family story was wrong. It usually just means the full picture is considerably messier and more layered than any single percentage on a screen could ever hope to capture. I think that's actually a fairly useful lesson to carry out of tonight's story more broadly. The real science we've spent the whole evening walking through: the ancient bones, the careful statistical modelling, the painstaking work of separating recent history from ancient history layer by layer, took teams of researchers years of specialised effort to get right, and even then they present their findings with careful ranges and honest uncertainty, attached rather than tidy overconfident percentages. Real answers about identity and ancestry are almost always messier, slower, and more interesting than any headline or any pie chart tends to let on. And once you actually understand how researchers untangle this kind of evidence, the entire back-and-forth story we followed tonight starts to feel less like a single surprising anomaly and more like a repeated provable pattern. The 2012 study found the thread. Later research using improved techniques and additional ancient remains recovered from the ground itself went on to pin down roughly when that thread first formed, and even managed to trace it through two separate distinct branches of ancestry, each one carrying its own particular story. Different research teams working years apart using completely different types of evidence kept arriving at the exact same conclusion from entirely different directions. That kind of independent convergence is about as close as any field of science ever gets to something resembling certainty. It's one thing for a single study to make a bold claim. It's something else entirely when 3 or 4 completely separate teams, using different samples, different methods, and different assumptions, all wander independently into the same conclusion from different corners of the map. Which brings us quite naturally to the people who actually lived this discovery out loud, generations before anyone ever sequenced a single strand of ancient genetic material to prove it. Because while modern researchers were busy filtering statistical noise out of laboratory samples, there were families living along both coastlines who never needed a peer-reviewed paper to tell them their relatives lived just across the water. They already knew. They'd been visiting each other for centuries, trading marrying and raising children on both shores long before anyone thought to ask a laboratory to confirm what those families had simply always understood as an ordinary, unremarkable fact of life. In a strange way, the science eventually just caught up to something the people themselves had never actually forgotten. Let's actually sit with that for a moment, because I don't think it gets nearly enough attention in most retellings of this particular corner of history. While researchers back in laboratories were carefully measuring genetic block lengths to estimate when roughly people first paddled back across this stretch of water, the families actually living along both coastlines had been treating that same water less like a boundary and more like a very cold, occasionally inconvenient front yard. Trade between the Siberian and Alaskan sides of the strait stretches back by some estimates close to 2,000 years long before any European power ever drew a line on a map anywhere near this part of the world. This wasn't some quaint occasional visit either. It was a functioning, sophisticated economic system run entirely by the people who actually lived there on their own terms, moving goods news and family gossip across the water, long before either side had a word in their own language for something as strange as a passport. Let me paint you a scene that captures this better than any dry summary could. In the summer of 1819, an American trading ship called the General San Martin sailed into the Bering Strait. Its captain, hoping to cash in on rumours of a booming fur market somewhere out at the edge of the known world. He had stopped in Kamchatka on the way north, where locals warned him the native peoples waiting near the strait had a reputation for being fierce, unpredictable, and not particularly interested in foreign visitors. What that captain found waiting for him was not some isolated, unprepared population eager for foreign goods. 18 large walrus hide boats carrying more than 200 armed Chukchi and Yupik traders surrounded his ship almost immediately, and at first simply refused to let him trade at all. Picture that scene for a moment: a single foreign sailing vessel, quietly encircled on open water by nearly 200 confident, well-armed local traders, entirely on their own turf, playing entirely by their own rules. These were not passive participants waiting to be discovered by the wider world. They already controlled a thriving cross-strait fur trade of their own, carrying knives, tobacco and beads over to Alaska, then returning to the Siberian shore loaded down with American furs to trade onward to Russian merchants. They were the middlemen, and they knew exactly how valuable that position made them. When larger commercial interests eventually tried cutting them out of that arrangement entirely, building trading posts directly on Alaskan rivers to bypass the native-controlled network altogether, the response was immediate and unambiguous. Local hunters attacked and burned one of those outposts to the ground. This was not some desperate, disorganized reaction. It was a calculated defense of an economic system These families had spent generations building and protecting the same fierce, uncompromising independence we already saw play out against an entire empire earlier tonight, this time turned toward protecting a livelihood rather than a homeland. I find something quietly satisfying about that, honestly. We tend to imagine indigenous peoples in these old historical accounts as background characters, waiting around for European ships to arrive and start the real story. Here the exact opposite was true. Foreign captains were the ones sailing nervously into someone else's well-established, tightly controlled marketplace, and native traders were the ones setting the terms. Now here's a detail that still catches me off guard every time I think about it. For most of this shared history, there was no international border here at all. Both shores, the Siberian side and the Alaskan side, belonged to the exact same empire. Imperial Russia held claim to both coastlines simultaneously, which meant that for generations this entire stretch of water sat inside a single political territory, even while functioning as two culturally distinct, closely related communities. That changed in 1867 when Russia sold Alaska to the United States, and suddenly almost overnight an international boundary existed directly through the middle of a place that had never needed one before. But here's the part I find almost funny in a slightly bittersweet way. On paper, two separate nations now technically owned opposite shores of this narrow strait. In actual lived practice, almost nothing changed for years afterward. Families kept crossing, trade kept flowing, marriages kept happening. A line drawn by diplomats sitting in offices thousands of miles away simply didn't carry much weight against relationships that had been maintained for dozens of generations already. Have you ever had a family member move somewhere technically far away, only to realize the actual relationship barely changed at all, because you'd simply built the habit of staying close, regardless of the distance? I imagine something similar was happening here, just stretched across an international border instead of a few states. This wasn't only about trade goods changing hands either. Marriages regularly crossed the strait in both directions, weaving Chukchi, Siberian, Yupik, and Alaskan families together into a single, sprawling web of cousins-in-laws and shared grandchildren that simply ignored whatever line happened to sit on a map somewhere in a government office. A man might grow up hearing stories about an aunt living on the far shore, someone he would eventually meet in person during a summer trading trip, not through some rare extraordinary journey, but as an entirely ordinary part of growing up in this particular corner of the world. Children were raised quite literally with relatives on both continents, long before either continent had bothered building a single road connecting anyone to anywhere. This closeness left behind something beautifully specific, something I want to share with you before we move any further into tonight's story. Among the Yupik communities living on both sides of the strait, oral storytellers passed down entire collections of shared folklore tales told almost identically on St. Lawrence Island in Alaska and along the Siberian coast in Russia, despite the political border running directly between the two. One particular collection, gathered by a Russian linguist and later carefully translated by a Yupik elder named Christopher Kunuka, from the village of Gamble, preserves 35 of these ancient stories, proof in narrative form of exactly how deeply intertwined these two supposedly separate populations always were. The same jokes, the same warnings passed to children, the same family names showing up in stories told an entire ocean crossing apart. When that collection was finally published, elders on both shores reportedly recognized entire passages word for word, stories their own grandparents had told them decades earlier, despite an ocean, and eventually an entire ideological divide sitting between the two versions the whole time. Think about what that actually means for a moment. A joke your great-grandmother told you as a child still making people laugh in roughly the same form on the opposite side, of an international border among people your own family hadn't been legally permitted to visit in decades. Culture, it turns out, can be remarkably stubborn about staying connected even after governments have done everything in their power to pull the threads apart. Sadly, this world of open crossing did not last forever, and the first real threat to it did not come from politics at all. It came from something considerably more immediate and destructive: commercial greed arriving by ship. Starting around the middle of the 1800s, American commercial whaling fleets began pouring into these waters, hunting on a scale the region had never experienced before. Between roughly 1849 and 1900, these fleets took more than 16,000 bowhead whales, along with close to 150,000 walrus numbers that simply could not be sustained by the ecosystem. These coastal communities had relied on for thousands of years. Traditional indigenous hunting had always operated within a kind of built-in restraint, taking only what a community actually needed to survive the coming winter, guided by exactly the kind of respectful relationship with these animals we talked about earlier in tonight's story. Commercial whaling operated by an entirely different logic: extraction for profit, with little regard for what remained afterward, or for the people whose entire existence depended on those same animals surviving in reasonable numbers. The consequences were brutal and immediate. Famine spread through communities that had depended on those same whale and walrus populations for food, tools, fuel, and shelter for longer than anyone could remember. Entire villages were abandoned as families were forced to relocate in search of food that no longer existed where it always had before. Imagine watching the animals your grandparents hunted, your parents hunted, and you yourself had hunted your entire life, simply stop appearing, not because of some natural cycle you understood and could plan around, but because ships from a different continent had quietly stripped the ocean bare in the span of a few decades. This was not a distant abstract tragedy playing out on the other side of the world. This was real families in living memory of people whose descendants are alive today, watching an entire way of life collapse within the span of a single working lifetime, because of decisions made by shipping companies thousands of miles away who would never actually see the consequences firsthand. It's worth pausing here because I think this detail matters more than it usually gets credit for. When we talk about the forces that eventually pulled these two connected coastlines apart, it's tempting to jump straight to the dramatic political story most people already vaguely know. But the truth is messier and honestly more familiar than that. Long before any government official ever drew a hard line through this water-unchecked commercial exploitation, had already begun quietly hollowing out the world that made the crossing worth making in the first place. And yet somehow these communities endured it. They adapted. They rebuilt. Families on both shores kept the relationship alive, kept crossing, when they could kept telling the same old stories to their children, right through the collapse of the whaling economy and well into the 20th century. Do you ever wonder what it would take to actually break a bond like that one strong enough to survive centuries of trade, an arbitrary international sale, and the near-total collapse of an entire regional food supply? I honestly didn't think anything short of the ocean swallowing this place all over again could manage it. What finally did manage to sever that connection completely and deliberately this time wasn't a market crash, and it wasn't overhunting. It came from something far stranger, a decision made not by whalers or traders chasing profit, but by two entire governments sitting in offices thousands of miles from this coastline, who decided almost as an afterthought that families who had been crossing this water since long before either nation even existed should simply stop. Not gradually. Not because the trade stopped being profitable or the whales stopped returning. Almost overnight by comparison, an invisible wall went up across water that had never once in 2,000 years of recorded contact actually managed to keep anyone apart. Let's talk about exactly how that wall went up, because the story behind it is stranger and honestly more human than most political history usually bothers to be. Barely a few years earlier, this same stretch of water had actually been a place of cooperation, not conflict. During the fighting of the 1940s, the United States funneled close to 8,000 military aircraft through this exact route, planes flown north through Alaska across the Bering Strait and handed over to Soviet pilots to help fight against a shared enemy overseas. For a brief stretch of history, this narrow, unremarkable channel of water was practically a runway for friendship between two future superpowers allies working side by side against the same threat. Then peace arrived and almost immediately everything curdled. In 1948, a decision was made in offices about as far from this coastline as it's possible to get without ever setting foot anywhere near it. The American Federal Bureau of Investigation under a director named J. Edgar Hoover and the Soviet government under Joseph Stalin quietly agreed that national security concerns outweighed whatever these native communities happened to want for themselves. A 10-year-old agreement that had allowed visa-free travel for indigenous families crossing the strait was simply suspended. In its place came something local. Residents eventually started calling the ice curtain a clear echo of the Iron Curtain dividing Europe at the exact same moment, sealing the border and cutting off contact between families who had been visiting each other since long before either government even existed. Here's a detail that still makes my stomach drop a little every time I think about it. The Soviet government did not simply post a few guards and call the matter closed. They forcibly removed the entire native population living on Big Diomede Island itself, the same island we talked about earlier tonight, sitting almost close enough to its Alaskan neighbour to shout across, and replaced those families with a military surveillance post, instead watching Alaska from the very ground where relatives of the people they were now watching had lived for generations. There was no gradual negotiation involved, no gentle transition period. Families who had lived on that island for as long as anyone could remember were simply told to pack what they could carry and leave, so that soldiers could move in and start watching through binoculars the very shoreline where their own cousins still lived. Imagine being physically removed from your own home on your own island, so that home could be repurposed into a listening post aimed squarely at your own family standing on the opposite shore. For the next 40 years, that was simply the reality here. Families who could on a clear day see the exact rooftop where a grandmother or an uncle lived were separated as thoroughly as if an entire ocean, rather than a couple of miles of cold water, sat between them. Letters mostly didn't get through. Visits were unthinkable. An entire generation of children grew up on one shore hearing stories about relatives on the other. Relatives they were told quite plainly they would likely never actually meet. Elders on both sides grew old, and in more than a few cases passed away still waiting for a reunion that kept getting postponed by forces entirely outside their control. Have you ever had family split apart by something completely outside anyone's control? A war, a border, a decision made by people who never once considered how it would land on the actual families involved. I think most of us, if we go back far enough in our own family trees, eventually find some version of that same wound. What finally started chipping away at that wall was not another government decision. It came almost entirely from ordinary people who simply refused to accept that the situation was permanent. Take a Nome, Alaska realtor named Jim Stimpfel, for example. In the mid-1980s, after hearing his own wife's family describe the old visits that used to happen before the border closed, Stimpfel decided to do something about it in the most delightfully improvised way imaginable. Standing at the local garbage dump one day, he noticed the wind blowing steadily west straight toward Russia. so he filled weather balloons with messages of friendship written out in Russian Siberian Yupik Inupiaq and English tucked in a bit of sugar and tobacco as a gesture of goodwill, and released them, hoping the wind might carry a little hope across the water where governments had refused to. There was no elaborate plan behind it, no funding, no diplomatic backing whatsoever. Just one ordinary man standing at a dump staring at the wind, deciding it might actually be worth a try. It's such a wonderfully stubborn, slightly absurd act of hope, and I love that it's a real, documented piece of how this story actually unfolded rather than something a screenwriter invented for effect. Around the same time, a musician from Juneau named Dixie Belcher organized something considerably more ambitious, leading 67 Alaska Native performers on a tour across the Soviet Union in 1986, singing and dancing specifically to promote peace between the two nations, at a moment when the American president himself was publicly describing the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Attention slowly began to build, fueled by ordinary citizens on both sides, who seemed considerably less interested in ideology than the governments claiming to represent them. But the moment that truly broke this story open involved neither a balloon nor a concert. It involved a woman in a swimsuit and roughly 2.5 miles of freezing open water. In August of 1987, an endurance swimmer named Lynn Cox entered the water near Little Diomede Island on the American side of the strait, wearing nothing more than a swimsuit, goggles and a cap, and swam directly toward Big Diomede on the Russian side through water sitting at a bone-rattling 38 degrees. No wetsuit, no support platform to climb onto and warm up, just muscle willpower and roughly 2 hours of continuous swimming through some of the coldest open water on the planet. Nearly the entire village of Little Diomede followed alongside her in small boats, many of them hoping quietly that they might finally be allowed to step onto that opposite shore and see relatives they hadn't laid eyes on in decades. Soviet officials only allowed a couple of those boats to actually land alongside her. But it was enough. Cameras were rolling. The story reached international press almost immediately, turning one woman's freezing swim into an impossible-to-ignore symbol of just how absurd this entire 40-year separation had become. Have you ever seen someone accomplish something so directly, so physically stubborn, that it becomes almost impossible for politicians sitting comfortably behind desks to keep pretending the problem isn't real? That's essentially what happened here. A grassroots letter-writing campaign followed almost immediately, built entirely on the momentum of that single swim. And then on the 13th of June 1988, an Alaska Airlines jet carrying 82 passengers, journalists, government officials and Alaska Native elders among them, lifted off from Nome and flew due west directly across the Bering Strait toward the Soviet town of Providenia. It was the first American commercial flight to land there in 40 years. Because the plane crossed the international date line along the way, the same line we talked about earlier tonight, passengers who left Alaska on the 13th actually touched down in Russia a full calendar day later, quite literally flying straight across a border in time itself, just to reach a place their own relatives had been waiting inside for 4 decades. One of the passengers aboard that flight, a woman named Darlene Pungawi Orr, stepped off the plane and was met almost immediately by distant relatives from a Russian coastal village most of her own family had never been permitted to visit. Try picturing that moment for a second, stepping off a plane onto a foreign runway in a country your own government had spent 40 years describing as an enemy, and finding actual family waiting there. People who share your bloodline, your language roots, and quite possibly, according to everything we've spent this entire evening exploring, a genetic thread stretching back thousands of years before either nation calling itself a country even existed. I can only imagine what that runway must have felt like that afternoon. Half-formed sentences stitched together across two languages. Strangers somehow already recognizing each other the way you sometimes recognize your own face in an old photograph of a relative you never actually met. Genetic ancestry, cultural memory, careful academic research stretching back thousands of years, all of it. We've spent this entire evening walking through together, and here finally was a living, breathing family reunion, happening in real time on a windswept runway 40 years and a single flight away from where it should have happened all along. I think that image says more about tonight's entire story than almost anything else we've covered. Every piece of evidence we've explored, the ancient bones, the flooded land bridge, the carved ivory, the careful genetic detective work, all of it, points toward the exact same quietly stubborn truth. Blood culture and memory move across water in ways that borders empires, and even entire ideologies have never actually managed to fully stop. Science can measure that connection with remarkable precision now. But these families never needed a laboratory to prove what they already carried inside themselves the whole time. What strikes me most honestly, looking back across everything we've walked through tonight, is how small the actual mechanism of separation always turns out to be compared to the depth of what it's trying to interrupt. An ocean rising over thousands of years couldn't fully separate these people. Empires spending vast fortunes on failed military campaigns couldn't fully separate them. Even the near collapse of an entire regional food supply couldn't manage it. And yet, two men sitting in offices on opposite sides of the planet signed a single quiet agreement in 1948, and that alone was enough to keep grandmothers from meeting their own grandchildren for 40 full years. Paper, it turns out, can sometimes accomplish what geography and time never quite could. So here's a question worth sitting with as we head into the last stretch of tonight's story. If genetics can trace a connection running back thousands of years, and politics can sever that same connection in a single afternoon, which one do you think actually tells us more about who we really are? Honestly, I don't think it's a fair question to answer cleanly, and I'm not sure it's supposed to be. Genetics can tell you where a thread of ancestry travelled and roughly when. It cannot tell you what language your grandmother sang to you and which recipe got passed down, at which holiday, or which stories you were raised believing about where you belong. Politics can draw a line across open water and enforce it with soldiers and paperwork. It cannot reach inside a person's chest and actually remove the pull they feel toward a place their family once called home. Both of these forces are real. Neither one on its own tells you the whole truth about a human being. I think the honest answer is that identity has never lived in just one of these categories. It lives in the friction between them, in the messy, unresolved space where a laboratory result and a grandmother's bedtime story both happen to be true at the same time. This actually brings up something worth addressing directly, because I suspect a decent number of you watching tonight have at some point absorbed a slightly oversimplified idea of what genetic ancestry actually means, and this seems like the right moment in the evening to gently untangle it. Here's a common misunderstanding, one that even shows up in fairly serious conversation sometimes. People often assume that genetics sorts humanity into neat separate boxes, distinct categories you either belong to or don't, the same way a country either does or doesn't appear on your passport. That is simply not how human genetic variation actually works. Decades of population genetics research have consistently found that the overwhelming majority of genetic variation among humans exists within any given population, not between different populations. Two people standing next to each other at a bus stop in the same city are statistically likely to differ from each other genetically almost as much as either of them differs from someone standing on the opposite side of the planet. The tidy separate categories most of us grew up picturing simply don't hold up once you actually look closely at the underlying biology. Think about it this way. If you tried sorting a rainbow into exactly 7 distinct separate boxes, you could technically do it, and the boxes might even look reasonably tidy sitting on a shelf. But you'd be imposing a boundary onto something that in actual physical reality shifts continuously from one shade into the next, with no true seam anywhere along the way. Human genetic variation behaves in almost exactly that manner, a long gradual gradient shaped by who lived near whom and who travelled where, rather than a set of cleanly separated categories waiting to be discovered. What ancestry testing and academic population genetics actually track is something considerably more subtle statistical patterns of shared history, gradual blending clines of connection stretching across geography and time, rather than sharp fenced-off borders. When researchers say a certain population carries a specific percentage of ancestry connected to a particular ancient group, they are describing a documented historical event, people moving, meeting and mixing at some point in the past. They are not sorting anyone into a fixed racial category. The Chukchi families we've spent so much of tonight discussing did not become less Asian or more American because of the ancestry threading through their genetic code. They simply carry an honest, provable record of an actual event their ancestors lived through. The science describes history. It was never designed to define identity, and treating it as though it does tends to flatten something beautifully complicated into something falsely simple. Have you ever taken one of those ancestry tests and felt a strange pressure to somehow act differently once the results came back, as though a percentage on a screen was supposed to change something about who you already knew yourself to be, maybe suddenly cooking a dish you'd never made before, or feeling oddly entitled to a culture you hadn't grown up inside of at all? I think that pressure says more about the culture around these tests than it does about the science itself. A percentage on a printout describes where some of your ancestors happen to stand at some point on a very long timeline. It does not hand you a passport to a lived experience you never actually had. Now here's something I think deserves real attention before we close out tonight's story, because it reframes everything we've covered in a much bigger light. This particular tale, people crossing an ocean, then turning around and crossing it again generations later, is not some strange isolated exception tucked away in one obscure corner of Arctic prehistory. Human history is quite frankly full of these reversals once you actually go looking for them. Take Central America, for example. Researchers studying the genetic makeup of Chibchan-speaking peoples, communities scattered across parts of modern-day Costa Rica, Panama and Colombia, discovered something that echoes almost exactly what we've spent this entire evening exploring. These populations carry ancestry connected to both North and South America, evidence of an ancient back migration flowing north out of South America, mixing back into populations that had generations earlier already pushed further south. Nobody planned this as some grand historical statement. It almost certainly unfolded the same quiet, practical way our own story tonight did, families following food, following opportunity, eventually following each other until an entire narrow strip of land between 2 continents ended up carrying genetic evidence of movement in both directions instead of just one. Same basic pattern, same fundamental lesson. Migration, once it happens, rarely stays a single, permanently closed chapter, and if you really want your mind properly bent, consider this. The same pattern shows up at the very beginning of the entire human story, not just in one regional chapter of it. Around 3,000 years ago, a substantial wave of people from Western Eurasia, the same broad region that produced the population who eventually left Africa in the first place tens of thousands of years earlier, turned around and flowed straight back into the continent their own distant ancestors had originally departed from. Researchers first confirmed this clearly through an ancient skeleton recovered from a cave in the Ethiopian highlands, a burial roughly 4,500 years old that predates this migration, and helped scientists measure exactly how much it changed the region afterward. Today, some populations in the Horn of Africa carry as much as 40% ancestry connected to that returning wave, a genetic signature substantial enough that early researchers initially mistakenly thought it had spread across the entire continent before more careful analysis narrowed the picture down. Humanity's very first journey out of Africa eventually, thousands of years later, curved back around and came home in numbers substantial enough to still show up clearly in the genetic code of people living there right now. Let that settle for a moment. The same basic story we followed across an entire evening involving one small cold stretch of ocean between Siberia and Alaska also played out independently thousands of miles away on an entirely different continent, using an entirely different ocean and an entirely different timeline, different geography, different climate, different peoples with no connection to each other whatsoever. And yet somehow the same underlying pattern kept repeating itself over and over across the full span of human history. Do you ever wonder how many other quiet reversals like this are still sitting undiscovered somewhere waiting for the right ancient skeleton or the right stubborn researcher to finally notice the pattern? I'd be willing to bet this is not the last one science eventually finds. Humanity has never been particularly good at making permanent decisions, migration included. If you think about your own family for a moment, is there a direction someone eventually walked away from only for a later generation to quietly find their way back toward it? Whether that means a country, a hometown, a certain kind of work, or even just a particular way of living, I'd guess more of you have an answer to that than expected once you actually go looking. I don't think that's a coincidence, honestly. I think it says something rather beautiful about what we actually are as a species. We like to imagine migration as a straight line on a map, one confident arrow pointing outward from some ancient point of origin, never looking back. But that arrow was never as straight as the textbooks made it look. Humanity has always been circling back on itself quietly, generation after generation, pulled by hunger, by memory, by the simple, stubborn feeling that somewhere behind you still counts as home, even after your own family stopped being able to explain exactly why. So maybe that's the real answer to the question I left you with a moment ago. Genetics and politics are not actually competing for the same job. Genetics tells you where the thread has already travelled. It cannot tell you where it's headed next, and it was never supposed to. That part, the part about where you choose to walk, who you choose to call family, and which shoreline you decide is worth paddling back toward, has always belonged entirely to the people living the story, not to the science quietly measuring it after the fact. I think that's actually a fairly comforting thought if you let it sit long enough. You're not simply the sum total of a percentage breakdown on a screen. You're also every choice your family ever made to stay close, to reach back, to keep a story alive specifically so someone like you could eventually hear it. The genetics gave us the receipts. The people themselves wrote the actual story. Which brings us finally back to that same quiet riverbank in Kamchatka, where we started tonight's entire journey, and to everything those 3 sets of bones were actually trying to tell us all along. Because now that we've walked through every piece of this puzzle together, the vanished grassland, the flooded strait, the fierce independence, the carved ivory, the laboratory detective work, the family reunions on a windswept runway, we finally have everything we need to understand exactly what those bones were quietly holding on to all these thousands of years later. So let's go back there one last time to that quiet stretch of riverbank in the far east of Russia, where 3 sets of bones sat waiting in the cold ground for longer than most civilizations have even existed. Picture it once more, the steel-coloured water, the cold wind rolling down off the mountains, The small team of archaeologists on their knees in the dirt with absolutely no idea yet what they were actually about to uncover. Back at the very beginning of tonight's story, that scene was nothing but a mystery, a strange puzzle with no context attached to it. 3 people buried on the wrong continent carrying threads of ancestry that made no sense according to everything scientists thought they understood. If you were only just joining us for that opening scene, it probably felt like an unsolvable riddle. Now, having walked through nearly every piece of the puzzle together, I suspect those same 3 graves feel entirely different. You know about the grassland that used to stand where open ocean now sits, an entire lost world, swallowed by rising water so gradually that nobody alive at the time could have pointed to a single day when it finally disappeared for good. You know about the small mixed population who once found themselves stranded on that grassland, cut off from everyone else on the planet, for longer than most of us can even picture clearly, until finally driven forward by nothing more dramatic than hunger and hope. Some of them kept walking into a continent no human being had ever seen before. You know about the coastal families who stayed behind entirely, who built one of the most sophisticated Arctic cultures on the planet out of walrus, hide reindeer bone and sheer stubborn resolve, and who fought off an empire for 150 years without ever losing their independence. And you know now exactly what happened next. That a handful of descendants of the people who crossed into a brand new world eventually turned back around, climbed into boats built by hand, and paddled home carrying with them an entirely new way of relating to the sea, one that would eventually blossom into an art style so intricate it still leaves museum curators quietly amazed today. You know how family ties kept crossing that same water for thousands of years afterward, trading, marrying, telling the same jokes on both shores, right up until 2 governments decided almost as an afterthought that the relationship should simply stop. And you know how it took a stubborn realtor with some weather balloons, a fearless woman swimming through freezing water, and finally one single flight crossing an entire international border to prove that none of it had actually stopped at all. Every piece of that story lives inside those 3 sets of bones on the riverbank. Not as some strange anomaly science eventually had to explain away, but as quiet physical proof of something considerably larger, a truth that keeps showing up over and over whenever we actually bother to look closely enough at our own history. Before we close the book on this one, I want to take a moment for the people who actually made this story worth telling in the first place, because it's easy in a video like this to let real human beings quietly blur into background scenery for a bigger narrative. The reindeer herders who built an entire portable civilization out of hide and wood, the coastal hunters who faced down whales with hand-carved harpoons and somehow made it look almost routine, the warriors who held off an empire without ever losing their freedom, the artists who spent hours decorating a hunting tool nobody but them would ever fully appreciate, the realtor with his balloons, the swimmer in the freezing water, the woman stepping off a plane into the arms of relatives she never thought she would actually meet. None of them were footnotes. Every one of them was the whole point. Here it is as plainly as I know how to say it. Nobody's story ever really moves in one direction. We love drawing history as a single confident arrow across a map, one clean line from origin to destination. But real human lives have never actually cooperated with that kind of tidy storytelling. People wander. People double back. People carry a stubborn kind of homesickness for places they've never physically stood in, passed down, quietly through a grandmother's recipe, a half-remembered lullaby, or, as it turns out, through something written directly into their own cells. If someone asked you tonight to draw your own family's story as a single arrow on a map, one clean line from wherever your people started to wherever you happen to be sitting right now, do you honestly think that line would stay straight the whole way through? I doubt mine would. I'd guess yours probably wouldn't either. Have you ever felt pulled towards somewhere you've never actually been for reasons you couldn't quite explain to anyone who asked? I think that feeling is more common and more meaningful than most of us give it credit for. Maybe it's not always nostalgia for a place. Sometimes I suspect it's simply an old story still quietly finishing itself generations later through you. A pull with no clear address attached to it, just a direction, and a strange stubborn sense that the direction matters. I keep coming back to something we touched on earlier tonight, the idea that home was never just the place someone's ancestors left behind. For the people in this story, home stayed something worth paddling back toward, even after nobody left alive could fully explain why it still mattered. I think that's true for a lot of us too, in smaller, quieter ways. Maybe you've never crossed an ocean chasing a feeling like that. But I'd bet plenty of you have made a much smaller version of the exact same choice. At some point, moving back to a hometown you swore you'd never return to cooking a dish. Nobody taught you properly because some instinct told you it mattered, or simply feeling unexpectedly at peace the moment you stepped somewhere you'd never technically been before but somehow already recognized. That more than any single date or any single percentage on a laboratory printout might be the real lesson sitting quietly inside this entire story. Borders get drawn by people who will never live inside the consequences of their own decisions. Oceans rise and fall and rise again on a calendar far too slow for any of us to notice happening in real time. Empires spend fortunes trying to control land that was never really theirs to control in the first place, and eventually more often than the history books like to admit they lose anyway. But underneath all of that noise, something considerably older and considerably more patient keeps moving anyway, generation after generation, refusing to stay put, refusing to stay gone, circling back toward home exactly when home needs it most. Governments rise and fall within a single human lifetime. Family, it turns out, plays a much longer game. So the next time somebody tells you a story about ancient migration, a single confident arrow moving in one direction and never looking back, I hope you remember these 3 quiet graves on a Russian riverbank and the stubborn, complicated, deeply human truth hiding underneath them. The story was never that simple. It never has been for any of us. There's something almost fitting about how long it's taken us to walk through all of this together tonight, honestly. A story, this patient one that took thousands of years to fully reveal itself, was never going to fit neatly into a few rushed minutes. If you're still here with me this deep into the evening, thank you for giving this particular history the time it actually deserved. Most stories this quiet get skipped over entirely in favour of something louder and faster. I'm glad this one found you instead. I would honestly love to know which part of tonight's story stuck with you the most. Whether it was that opening mystery, the vanished world beneath the waves, the family reunion on that windswept runway, or something else entirely that caught you somewhere in between. Maybe it was something smaller than any of that one single sentence that happened to land at exactly the right moment tonight. Drop it in a comment if you feel like sharing. I do read through them, and it always means more than you'd probably guess. And if stories like this one, the quiet, strange, deeply human corners of history most people never get told, are exactly the reason you keep finding your way back here, night after night, consider tapping that like button or hitting subscribe so more of these can find their way to you as well. It honestly helps more than you'd expect, and it costs you nothing. But a couple of seconds you were probably going to spend scrolling past something far less interesting anyway. For now though, let the light stay low a little longer. Let whatever thoughts this story stirred up settle gently the way silt eventually settles at the bottom of still water, quietly, without any rush at all. Whatever pulled you toward this particular story tonight, whatever quiet homesickness or curiosity or simple need for a calm voice in a dark room, I hope it found exactly what it was looking for. Somewhere out on that same cold stretch of water tonight, whether or not either of us will ever actually see it, the tide is still moving exactly the way it has for longer than any government, any border, or any single human life has ever managed to last. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't remember which flag happens to be planted on which shore. It just keeps moving patiently the same way it always has, the same way I suspect it always will. Rest well tonight. Let your own thoughts drift a little the way a small skin boat might drift across calm water on a clear evening in no particular hurry to reach anywhere at all. And whenever you're ready for another one of these quiet, strange, deeply human corners of history, I will be right here waiting to wander into the next story together.